Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet, unsettling story of a man who wandered the national forests of the Southeast for years, unnoticed, unchallenged, and far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Gary Michael Hilton. To most people, he looked like nothing more than an older drifter, a man with a worn backpack, a tired smile, and a habit of camping along remote trails. But behind that harmless exterior lived a restless paranoia, a growing darkness, and a need for control that would turn peaceful hiking paths into silent crime scenes. As hikers disappeared across Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida, the forests themselves became part of the mystery, vast, calm, and hiding the truth beneath their shadows. And through it all, Hilton moved like a ghost, slipping between trailheads, watching strangers, and believing the wilderness would always protect him. Tonight, we'll trace that journey, from his drifting life to the investigation that finally exposed everything he tried to hide. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me which country you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always amazing seeing this late-night true crime family around the world. So settle in, let the day fade, and follow me into the stillness of the forest, where one man lived unseen for far too long. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. A new story waits for you every night. Chapter 1, Roots in the Wilderness, the early life of Gary Michael Hilton. Long before Gary Michael Hilton became a name whispered across hiking trails and forest ranger briefings, he was a quiet boy growing up in the shifting landscapes of post-war America, a place where families moved often, where children learned to adapt quickly, and where silence sometimes grew louder than words. Hilton was born into a household that changed shape frequently, marked by instability, uncertainty, and emotional distance. His earliest memories were not rooted in warmth or belonging but in motion, the sense that nothing around him stayed still long enough to feel safe. As a young child, Gary was restless, sensitive, and often withdrawn. Adults around him noticed that he struggled with consistency. He had trouble connecting with other children, but not because he lacked intelligence or awareness. Rather, he seemed to observe the world from the outside, as though he never fully stepped into the role expected of him. Teachers described him as bright but easily frustrated, a boy who could focus deeply on something one moment and become lost in his own thoughts the next. Home wasn't a place where he found grounding. Family members had conflicting accounts of his early upbringing, some describing it as chaotic, others as quietly troubled. What remained consistent was that Gary grew up without a sense of emotional security. His father was often absent, physically or emotionally. His mother struggled to maintain order. And Gary existed somewhere in between, searching for structure in a world that rarely offered it. By the time he was in grade school, he had begun showing signs of inner tension, sudden mood swings, flashes of anger, and moments where he seemed overwhelmed by even small frustrations. Yet at other times, he could be polite, surprisingly kind, or even eager to please. It created a confusing picture for anyone trying to understand him. He wasn't outwardly violent. But he carried a tension beneath the surface, a tension that often made other children uncomfortable. One of the few places where young Gary seemed at ease was outside. He had a fascination with the woods, trails, and quiet natural spaces. Unlike the crowded noise of school halls or the unpredictability of home life, nature offered a kind of calm structure, a world that was quiet, dependable, and free of judgment. He spent long stretches wandering near wooded areas, following trails until he knew them by instinct. To adults, it looked like harmless exploration. But for Gary, these solitary walks were something deeper, a place where he could disappear into silence and escape the emotional noise he didn't know how to navigate. As he grew older, the disconnect between his inner world and the expectations around him only widened. Teachers noticed he drifted between efforts to fit in and moments of simmering frustration. He tried joining clubs, sports teams, and school activities, but the social dynamics always made him uncomfortable. He had difficulty understanding unspoken social rules, when to speak, when to step back, how to process rejection or embarrassment. He wanted to be part of something, yet didn't know how. At home, the tension became harder to hide. Arguments erupted more frequently. He began expressing resentment toward family members, particularly toward authority figures. Small disciplinary actions triggered outsized reactions, as though each scolding hit a nerve far deeper than the surface behavior. His emotional world was heavy, and he didn't know how to manage it. By the start of adolescence, this inner conflict became more visible. Gary's moods grew more unpredictable, his sense of identity more fractured. Some days he wanted to be helpful and likable, other days he withdrew into silence for hours. Adults described him as a boy who seemed older than his years in some ways and painfully unprepared for the world in others. But there was one consistent pattern. He kept drifting toward isolation. The woods became more than a refuge, they became a world where he felt in control. He spent entire afternoons exploring, memorizing paths, climbing into spaces where he could watch the world without being seen. He felt comfortable there in a way he didn't feel anywhere else. And while nobody could have predicted the future, these early solitary habits would become significant, shaping how he learned to think, how he learned to move, and how he learned to escape notice. As adolescence progressed, Gary's behavior took on sharper edges. He struggled with school authority, clashed with other students, and displayed a growing sense of detachment. At the same time, he began showing signs of heightened anxiety, worrying excessively about things he couldn't control while ignoring responsibilities he could. People around him saw contradictions, but Gary himself didn't see them at all. To him, life felt scattered, overwhelming, and unpredictable. His family moved again, adding another layer of instability. With each move, Gary had to start over, new school, new neighbors, new environment. And each time, he became more withdrawn, more resistant to forming meaningful connections. The idea of belonging felt increasingly distant. He learned how to be invisible. How to keep his thoughts hidden. How to maintain a calm exterior while chaos churned underneath. By his mid-teens, the signs of internal struggle were unmistakable. He had difficulty maintaining friendships. He grew more disconnected from his peers. Teachers reported he seemed either distracted or unusually intense. There were moments when he tried to fit in, but the effort exhausted him. He lacked the social confidence others his age took for granted, and he often responded to emotional discomfort with avoidance rather than confrontation. And yet, he wasn't seen as dangerous. Just troubled. Just odd. Just a boy who didn't quite fit. But the seeds were already planted, seeds of isolation, secrecy, and dependence on the quiet spaces of the natural world. Seeds that would shape his adult life far more than anyone could have imagined. Gary Michael Hilton was not born a predator. He was shaped, slowly and silently, by instability, isolation, and a growing sense that the world made more sense when he was alone, especially in the woods. And in the years that followed, that quiet preference for solitude would evolve into something far darker. As Gary moved into the late stages of adolescence, the gap between him and the world around him grew wider, more defined. He wasn't just a quiet boy anymore, he was a young man who seemed uncertain of his place in society. His peers were learning who they were, forming identities, setting goals. Gary, on the other hand, seemed suspended between versions of himself, the part that wanted structure and belonging, and the part that recoiled from anything that required emotional vulnerability. One teacher recalled him as someone who drilled holes into you with his silence, a description meant not as a warning but as an observation of how intensely he sometimes stared while saying nothing. He wasn't violent. He wasn't explosive. But he carried an unpredictable aura, as if he was quietly evaluating the world, trying to understand why he didn't feel naturally connected to it. It wasn't that he lacked intelligence. He was bright, often capable of deep focus on subjects that drew his interest. He enjoyed reading about wilderness survival, exploring unfamiliar paths, and studying maps. But he struggled with subjects requiring social interaction or emotional nuance. He focused on what made sense to him: patterns, landscapes, predictability. People, with their shifting moods and inconsistencies, were harder to decode. And his home life didn't offer clarity. His family structure remained unstable. Arguments simmered. Boundaries blurred. Expectations were unclear. Gary drifted through his teenage years with no emotional anchor, no adult who fully understood him, and no stable environment to help him develop a healthy sense of identity. Isolation didn't just become a habit, it became a shield, a way to keep his inner world intact. By the time he approached adulthood, the outdoors had become the place where he felt most capable. He knew how to navigate trails, how to use a compass, how to read weather patterns, and how to survive with minimal supplies. These weren't skills learned in structured programs or through mentorship. They were learned through repetition, experimentation, and instinct. In many ways, nature became Gary's teacher, patient, predictable, and free of judgment. This connection to the wilderness shaped him more deeply than anyone realized. When he felt overwhelmed, he walked. When he felt misunderstood, he withdrew into the trees. He learned to think in the quiet, to solve problems while moving through winding paths, to feel in control only when surrounded by solitude. This relationship with the outdoors wasn't unhealthy on its own. Many people find peace in nature. But for Gary, the woods became not just a refuge, but an identity, the place where he believed he functioned best, where his thoughts aligned, where the noise of human life didn't echo as loudly. And this belief would follow him into adulthood, influencing where he lived, how he traveled, and eventually, how he hunted. As he approached his late teens, the mounting instability in his life led him toward the military, a place where structure, discipline, and routine were promised. The military offered the order he had never found at home, and for a time, it provided exactly that. He responded well to the strict rules, the clear expectations, and the predictable rhythm of training. But beneath the surface, the same feelings of disconnection persisted. The same mood swings. The same difficulty forming emotional bonds. He performed adequately, sometimes. Impressively, but inconsistently. Superiors noticed he could be both highly focused and unexpectedly withdrawn. He followed orders, but his emotional responses were sometimes mismatched to the situation. He could be overly calm during tension, or overly reactive to small frustrations. They didn't see him as unstable, but they sensed misalignment, as though his internal world didn't match the external expectations. A medical discharge eventually ended his service, and with it, the last structured environment he would ever know. Once again, Gary found himself drifting, not aimlessly, but without direction. He lived in various states, took on different jobs, and moved frequently, never settling long enough to build relationships or establish roots. He was a man always passing through. And during this period of wandering, the woods called to him more strongly than ever. He began spending longer periods in national forests, camping for days or weeks, living out of small vehicles, learning how to remain unseen. These weren't vacations. They weren't hobbies. They were escapes, from responsibility, from emotional expectations, from society itself. He studied trails with the same intensity others might give to textbooks. He learned which paths were busiest, which overlooked areas were rarely patrolled, and which entrances offered the quietest ways in and out. He became a quiet ghost of the wilderness, a man who could blend into the background of any forest, unnoticed by hikers who passed him on the trails. This wasn't yet a transformation into violence. But it was preparation. Preparation for a life lived outside the boundaries most people rely on. With each passing year, his ability to move unnoticed through public spaces, especially wooded ones, increased. He learned to survive with minimal supplies. He learned how to stay invisible even in populated parks. And he developed a sense of comfort in the quiet isolation of nature that few people truly understand. To Gary, the woods were not dangerous. People were. And this belief, shaped across years of instability, emotional distance, and growing detachment, slowly created the framework that would one day make him one of the most quietly dangerous predators in the American Southeast. His early life did not create the monster he would become. But it shaped the landscape in which that monster could exist. A landscape of silence, isolation, and vast, unguarded forest trails. In the stillness of his childhood and adolescence, the seeds of his future were planted. And the wilderness, the place where he always felt most at home, would become the stage where his darkness finally stepped forward. Chapter 2, A Drifting Soul, Life on the Edge of Society. When Gary Michael Hilton stepped out of the structured world of the military and back into civilian life, it was as if the ground beneath him shifted once again. The routines that had kept him anchored, the clear expectations, the predictable order, the sense of belonging that came with wearing a uniform, were suddenly gone. In their place was a world that felt too loose, too noisy, and too unforgiving for someone who never truly understood how to stand comfortably within it. Many veterans struggle with reintegration, but for Gary, the disorientation cut deeper. He didn't simply miss the structure, he depended on it. And without it, he drifted, not just physically, but psychologically. Friends who knew him described a noticeable change after his discharge. He became more restless, more unpredictable, more disconnected from any sense of purpose. The world moved forward, and he seemed to hover just outside of it, unsure where to step next. He tried to settle into jobs, short-term work in construction, roofing, and various labor roles. He was competent but inconsistent. Co-workers recalled moments when he seemed friendly, chatty even, talking about politics, survival skills, and outdoor life. Then, without warning, he would retreat into silence, avoiding eye contact, disappearing into his thoughts. He was like a shifting shadow, part of the environment one moment, and oddly detached the next. Gary frequently clashed with supervisors. Small criticisms hit him with the force of personal attacks. Instructions he perceived as unnecessary triggered irritation. He didn't cope well with authority, especially when it wasn't as structured or predictable as the military. While some saw his volatility as arrogance, others sensed it came from something more fragile, a man who didn't know how to express frustration without withdrawing into anger or retreating into isolation. With each job he lost or quit, his connection to society thinned a little more. Bills piled up. Social circles faded. And Gary, overwhelmed by the pressure to exist in a world that demanded responsibilities he couldn't consistently manage, turned increasingly toward the one environment where he felt competent, the wilderness. He began spending long periods living out of his vehicle, first a small car, then eventually the white van that would become inseparable from his identity. These weren't planned camping trips or seasonal excursions. They were escapes. He traveled across states, visiting national forests in Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and beyond. He learned the landscape with a kind of intimacy that most people reserve for the streets of their hometowns. The hum of civilization vanished as soon as he stepped onto a trail. To strangers he met on the road, Gary appeared as a typical drifter, older, worn, carrying the kind of weathered confidence that comes from a lifetime of moving. Some found him odd, others found him friendly. He had a way of blending in while still feeling slightly out of place. He could chat about hiking gear, trail safety, or forest history with impressive knowledge. But he also had moments where his energy shifted, where he seemed too intense, too focused, or too defensive about harmless questions. The more time he spent in the woods, the more the outside world seemed unreal to him. He talked frequently about society being corrupt, about people losing touch with nature, about technology rotting the minds of younger generations. He wasn't a radical, not a conspiracist, more like a man who had quietly convinced himself that his discomfort with society meant he didn't belong to it. As the years passed, his drifting became a lifestyle rather than a phase. He lived cheaply, often on the margins of legality, relying on odd jobs, occasional disability payments, and small acts of manipulation to get by. He developed a knack for convincing people to help him, not through charm, but through persistence. He would ease into conversations with strangers, sometimes asking for small amounts of money, other times requesting a ride or a meal. Many people obliged, seeing him as a harmless older man down on his luck. But beneath that exterior, his anger simmered. He grew increasingly resentful toward society, blaming others for his failures, his hardships, his loneliness. He believed the world owed him something: respect, attention, comfort, and he resented anyone who seemed to have more stability than he did. His mental state shifted further during these years. There were signs of paranoia, moments when he insisted people were watching him, judging him, trying to manipulate him. He could be charming one moment and confrontational the next. Some acquaintances described him as off, without being able to explain why. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he understood the world better than everyone else, yet his life was defined by instability. Still, despite his volatility, nothing about him screamed danger. He wasn't outwardly violent. He didn't make threats. He didn't fit the image of someone who would one day terrify hikers across multiple states. He was simply a drifter, one of thousands, fading into the background of America's roads and forests. But the forests were changing him. The more time he spent alone in nature, the more he romanticized a life free from society's rules. He developed an almost spiritual attachment to the wilderness, not to its beauty, but to its isolation. He saw the forest as a place where consequences didn't exist, where movement was unnoticed, and where the world finally made sense. He began to study trails not just for navigation, but for strategy, which paths had the thickest tree lines, which campgrounds were isolated, which scenic overlooks offered easy escape routes. He watched hikers from a distance, noticing patterns: who traveled alone, who carried heavy gear, who seemed confident versus timid. These observations began as passive habits, the instincts of a man who learned to study the world from the outside. But over time, they evolved into something deeper, something darker. Gary Michael Hilton had become a man who was not just disconnected from society, but increasingly resentful of anyone who seemed comfortable within it. And as his bitterness grew, the wilderness, once a refuge, began to feel like a stage. A stage where nobody watched. Nobody questioned. Nobody intervened. A stage where a drifter could move through the trees unnoticed, carrying whatever darkness he'd been shaping all along. Hilton's drifting years stretched into a blurred timeline: no single address, no lasting friendships, no meaningful relationships. He lived in a quiet loop of motion: work a little, save a little, disappear into the woods until he ran out of money, then return to society just long enough to repeat the cycle. To him, this wasn't instability, it was freedom. And yet, beneath the surface, the cycle was feeding something darker, a growing sense of superiority mixed with resentment, a belief that he saw the world clearly while others were blind. He became increasingly talkative with strangers during these years, but his conversations followed a familiar pattern. He'd begin casually, asking about their travels or equipment, but soon the tone shifted. He'd become forceful, argumentative, or oddly philosophical, as though he were trying to teach them something. People described feeling cornered by his intensity. Even when he smiled, it never fully softened the sharpness in his eyes. Gary's interactions with the outside world were unpredictable because his emotions were unpredictable. Some days he was friendly and eager to help other hikers. Other days he was filled with frustration, toward society, toward the government, toward anyone who reminded him of a life he believed had wronged him. He blamed others for his failures but saw himself as a victim of circumstance rather than someone responsible for his own path. Over time, his resentment hardened into something more structured. He began speaking openly about how people wasted their lives, how they didn't appreciate nature, how they moved through the world without awareness. This bitterness didn't burst outward in violence during these years, but it created a mindset where he increasingly saw others as obstacles, annoyances, or intruders. His sense of self was unstable but oddly inflated. He believed he was smarter than most people he met, more observant, more capable, more connected to the world's true rhythm. And yet he lived in poverty, in isolation, in a loop he couldn't escape. These contradictions weighed on him, feeding the volatility simmering beneath his calm exterior. As he aged into his 40s and 50s, this internal dissonance worsened. His body grew thinner, his movements less steady, but his sense of entitlement grew sharper. He began to feel overlooked, underestimated. The world kept moving, and he felt stuck, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he rejected every system that required emotional or social involvement. To outsiders, he wasn't frightening, just eccentric. A man who had carved out a rugged lifestyle in the woods, someone who seemed more comfortable with trees than people. He was the kind of man hikers might meet briefly on a trail, trade a few words with, and forget about by nightfall. But those who knew him more closely saw something else, a man who could flip between friendliness and hostility without warning, who carried grudges too easily, who reacted sharply to any perceived slight. His life on the road exposed him to countless brief human connections, moments where he practiced reading people. He learned how to predict behavior, how to sense fear or uncertainty, how to identify those who wouldn't challenge him. These weren't deliberate lessons at first, but rather adaptive instincts that grew stronger as he aged. In the woods, he observed hikers the way some people watch passing cars, casually, but with an undercurrent of calculation. He watched their pace, their confidence, their gear, their awareness of their surroundings. He watched how far they strayed from main trails, how long they lingered at overlooks, whether they traveled alone or in groups. To him, these observations were simply part of his life, another layer of the wilderness he had come to understand so well. But over time, these quiet observations created a mental framework where he saw opportunity in isolation. A person alone on a trail wasn't just a hiker, they were someone without immediate protection, someone whose disappearance might go unnoticed for hours or days. Yet, during these drifting years, Hilton still moved within the boundaries of society often enough to conceal the darker shifts within him. He found odd jobs, cleaned buildings, did maintenance work, and occasionally charmed property owners into trusting him. He could present himself as harmless when it benefited him. He could seem humble, grateful, even gentle, especially when he needed money, food, or a temporary place to stay. This ability to shape his demeanor was one of the clearest signs of where his mind was headed. He wasn't disconnected from reality. He understood social cues. He knew how to adapt his behavior. But rather than using that understanding to build relationships, he used it to avoid suspicion. To remain unremarkable. To remain unnoticed. As he aged further, bitterness became his constant companion. He resented people who appeared happier or more successful. He resented those who move confidently through the world. He resented his own aging body, which felt increasingly like a betrayal, a reminder that time was passing while he remained stuck in the same cycle. And with nowhere to direct these emotions, he projected them onto the world around him. By the time he reached his 60s, Gary Hilton had become a fully isolated figure, a man with no stable home, no stable work, and no real human connections. But he still carried a deep need for control, for power, for validation of the superiority he believed he possessed. The wilderness encouraged his isolation. His isolation encouraged his resentment. And his resentment began to shape his worldview. Hikers saw the national forests as places of beauty, recreation, or escape. Hilton saw them as something else entirely. A world without witnesses. A world where he understood every path and every silence. A world where he felt he finally had the advantage. This combination, a drifting life, deep-seated bitterness, and an intimate understanding of the woods, created a perfect storm. Not all drifters become dangerous. Not all loners become predators. But for Gary Michael Hilton, the wilderness became the perfect environment for the darkest parts of his mind to find expression. The stage was set. The player was in place. And the forest, silent, vast, indifferent, was waiting. Chapter 3, Cracks in the Mask, Strange Behavior and Early Red Flags. As the years rolled on, Gary Michael Hilton's behavior shifted from merely eccentric to something that began unsettling the people he crossed paths with. These weren't violent outbursts or criminal incidents, not yet. They were smaller things, quieter things, the kind of moments that lingered in the back of people's minds without giving them enough reason to call the police. Red flags, subtle but undeniable. Many who interacted with Hilton later described a sense of unease they couldn't fully articulate. He wasn't threatening in appearance. He wasn't loud or aggressive in the way dangerous people are often stereotyped. Instead, the discomfort came from something beneath the surface, the way he watched people too closely, or how his facial expressions didn't match his words. It was the way he seemed both calm and tense at the same time, like someone whose internal storm never fully quieted. During this phase of his life, Hilton drifted between jobs and living arrangements with increasing unpredictability. In some places, he lasted only a few weeks. In others, he settled in just long enough for neighbors to notice the peculiar rhythm of his life. He was often awake at strange hours, wandering outside late at night, pacing, muttering, or sorting items in his van by flashlight. He had a habit of talking to himself, long, animated conversations that only he could hear. Some nights he'd laugh quietly to no one, and other nights he'd shout into the air, his voice carried by the stillness of the surrounding woods. To those who lived near him during these periods, he seemed like a man walking along the edge of an unseen cliff, teetering, but never quite falling over. He also began developing a pattern of fixations. Certain people, usually hikers, younger individuals, or those who appeared vulnerable, drew his attention more intensely than others. He would watch them, memorize their habits, and sometimes follow them at a distance. Not closely enough to be confrontational, but closely enough that if they turned around, they'd feel the weight of his stare. And once they moved out of sight, he continued studying the path, the area, the environment, as though preparing for a test only he knew existed. These early behaviors were not crimes. They were moments of surveillance, curiosity, and odd fixation. But they were cracks, visible signs of a deeper shift happening inside him, a shift where observation slowly blended with intention. People who worked with him noticed changes as well. He became more irritable, less patient with criticism, and more prone to sudden outbursts of anger over small inconveniences. One coworker recalled a moment when Gary erupted into a rant after being asked to sweep a worksite, not because of the task itself, but because he felt the request implied he wasn't respected. His voice shook with emotion, his hands trembling as he spoke. It wasn't the anger of someone who simply disliked being told what to do. It was the anger of someone who felt deeply wounded by even minor challenges to his self-image. The insecurity that had followed him all his life began to morph into something sharper, a conviction that he was being underestimated, mistreated, or disrespected by nearly everyone he encountered. This belief, once just a quiet frustration, started to define him. Yet, when he sensed that his outbursts were too noticeable, he pulled the mask back into place. He'd apologize. He'd explain. He'd charm when necessary. He'd become helpful or polite, as though resetting the impression he had just destroyed. These shifts in behavior, from calm to volatile, from friendly to distant, became more frequent. They were unpredictable enough to unsettle people but not alarming enough to provoke intervention. Even more concerning were the moments when Gary seemed disconnected from reality. He talked about conspiracies that didn't exist, insisted people were following him, or claimed strangers were intentionally provoking him. None of these thoughts were grounded in actual events, but they felt real to him. And when he voiced them, even quietly, others recognized the intensity behind his words. He didn't sound delusional, he sounded convinced. During his long stretches living out of his van, he grew increasingly territorial. He screamed at people who came too close to his campsite. He glared at hikers who passed his parked vehicle. He barked orders at strangers who tried to make small talk. His sense of ownership over public spaces grew stronger, more rigid, less rational. And at times, he hinted at darker thoughts. Individuals who spent time with him described moments where he'd casually mention violence, not directly, but in strange comments about how people deserved consequences or how justice should be handled old school. He made remarks about how hikers were careless, how they weren't aware of their surroundings, how they walked right into trouble without even knowing it. At the time, these comments didn't raise alarms. Gary was older, eccentric, maybe a little bitter. People chalked it up to personality. But in hindsight, they were chilling glimpses into a mindset that was slowly shaping itself behind the scenes. The biggest red flag, however, wasn't his anger or paranoia. It was his growing obsession with control. He fixated on order, on routines, on having things exactly the way he imagined them. He grew increasingly irritated when people disrupted his expectations. He rehearsed conversations in his head, replayed arguments from the past, and created elaborate justifications for why he was always in the right. The mask he'd worn for so long, the mask of the quiet drifter, the friendly word here and there, the harmless outdoorsman, began to slip. More frequently. And behind it was a man who felt disrespected, overlooked, and entitled to reclaim control in ways no one could have anticipated. By now, he had developed a deep familiarity with the forests he wandered. He knew how to hide in plain sight, how to avoid ranger patrols, how to navigate obscure trails without leaving obvious traces. He knew which campgrounds were isolated, which trailheads attracted solo hikers, and which parts of the woods went days without human presence. His knowledge wasn't just recreational anymore. It had become an advantage. A foundation for something that hadn't yet happened. But was growing closer. The world around Gary Hilton didn't change suddenly. He did. Quietly. Gradually. In cracks and shadows that only became visible when it was too late. The early red flags were there. But subtle, scattered, easy to overlook. And soon, those cracks would widen. As Hilton moved into his later years, the red flags surrounding his behavior became more pronounced, no longer subtle quirks, but patterns that hinted at a man slowly unraveling. People began describing interactions with him that left them uneasy for reasons they couldn't fully explain. It wasn't one particular behavior that alarmed them, but the accumulation of small, unsettling moments that painted a clearer picture in hindsight. Gary wasn't just eccentric. He was simmering. He took on short-term jobs whenever he needed money, cutting lawns, cleaning properties, simple handyman work. At first, customers found him dependable enough. He was punctual, he worked quickly, and he didn't ask many questions. But as they observed him more closely, they noticed his mood could shift with startling speed. A friendly greeting might turn into a tense exchange if he perceived even the slightest criticism. A harmless suggestion about the work could trigger an hour-long rant about how people never respected him. One homeowner recalled seeing Hilton meticulously trimming the edges of driveway one moment, only to slam his tools into the ground the next, muttering angrily to himself. When she asked if he was all right, he snapped back with something sharp and defensive, then seconds later apologized as if nothing had happened. These shifts were baffling, unpredictable, and increasingly unnerving. He also developed a tendency to linger, hovering around customers after finishing a job. He'd talk about topics that felt strangely intense for casual conversation: government corruption, the weakness of modern society, or how most people lacked true survival skills. His words carried an unsettling edge, as if he believed he held insights the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. And while he didn't threaten anyone directly, his tone often suggested he was holding back a deeper frustration. Neighbors began recognizing his van, the same white vehicle he used as a mobile home, storage space, and, eventually, something far more sinister. He parked it in secluded spots, often leaving it for hours or days at a time before reappearing. Sometimes he slept in church parking lots, sometimes on trailheads, sometimes behind abandoned buildings. People noticed that he rarely stayed anywhere for long, as though he was avoiding being observed too closely. What stood out most, however, was how territorial he became over seemingly insignificant spaces. If someone parked near his van, he interpreted it as an intrusion. If hikers passed too close to his campsite, he glared at them until they moved on. There were even reports of him shouting at strangers who unknowingly walked through areas he considered his, even though those areas were public land. The forest, the trails, the edges of civilization, these spaces had become a world where he believed he alone understood the rules. Those who encountered him on hiking paths reported similar experiences. Hilton would appear friendly at first. He'd offer hiking advice or comment on the trail ahead. But if someone didn't respond the way he expected, his demeanor changed instantly. He'd become cold, suspicious, or silently watchful. Some hikers said he stared at them with an intensity that made their skin crawl, the gaze of a man who wasn't just looking at them, but studying them. A pattern emerged. Gary Hilton noticed people. But most importantly, he noticed the ones who were alone. He observed their gear, their confidence level, their direction, their awareness. He seemed to pay special attention to those carrying heavy packs or appearing tired, hikers who were slower, more distracted, or less experienced. Still, none of this behavior alone pointed to violence. Thousands of eccentric drifters roam the forests every year. Most are harmless. Most are lost in their own worlds. But with Gary, the combination of emotional volatility, isolation, and quiet resentment was forming a dangerous foundation. And within this foundation, another shift occurred. His self-image grew more distorted. He spoke more frequently about how the world had mistreated him, about how people lacked respect, about how society had no true strength. He saw others, particularly hikers with expensive gear, tourists exploring national parks, or young backpackers enjoying the trails, as symbols of privilege he believed he never received. Their freedom irritated him. Their happiness irritated him. Their presence in the forests he considered his irritated him deeply. This bitterness intertwined with his growing sense of expertise. He believed that living off the land made him superior. Superior to society. Superior to the hikers who passed by unaware. Superior to anyone who hadn't endured the hardships he claimed shaped him. This combination of resentment and superiority created a storm inside him. And like most storms, it intensified in silence. One of the most revealing red flags during this period was his escalating paranoia. Hilton became convinced that people were sabotaging him, landlords, employers, even strangers. He believed people were taking advantage of him, conspiring behind his back, or disrespecting him. These beliefs had no evidence, yet they fueled his anger. When something went wrong, a job ended, a bill came due, a stranger looked at him too long, he didn't see it as a coincidence. He saw it as an attack. And the forest became the place where he retreated to rebuild his sense of control. By his late 50s, Hilton's isolation had hardened into something unmovable. He no longer had friends. He no longer had anchors. He no longer had a life that included structure of any kind. He was drifting entirely, with only the woods as his guide. But the red flags didn't just come from his emotions. They came from his behavior. He began making alarming comments to acquaintances, things about how easy it was to disappear in the woods, how quickly someone could become lost, how long it took for hikers to be found if something happened to them. These remarks were packaged inside jokes or casual conversation, but the undertone was unmistakably dark. At the time, nobody connected these comments to violence. Why would they? He was just a strange, older man with too many opinions. But beneath those odd comments was a mindset shifting toward action. The mask was cracking. The boundaries between thought and behavior were thinning. The resentment was turning into justification. All the instability, all the bitterness, all the years of drifting, it was converging. Transforming. Preparing him for something he had not yet done. But was moving closer toward with each passing day. These early warnings were not dramatic. They were quiet. Subtle. Cumulative. And soon, they would become unmistakable. Chapter 4, Life in the Forests, A Nomadic Existence Takes Shape. By the time Gary Michael Hilton entered his 60s, the forests of the American Southeast were no longer just a place he visited, they had become the closest thing he had to a home. The wilderness wrapped around him like a second skin, offering a sense of belonging that he had never found in neighborhoods, workplaces, or crowded cities. The deeper he wandered into the quiet stretches of Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina, the more the forest seemed to echo the rhythm of his own internal world, silent, detached, unpredictable. Most people who hike through national forests see beauty first, the towering trees, the filtered sunlight, the winding paths that promise adventure. Hilton saw something else: order. Structure. Predictability. The forest operated on rules he understood instinctively. It didn't judge. It didn't ask questions. It didn't expect anything from him except survival. And survival was the one skill he believed he had mastered. He lived out of his van for months at a time, moving between state parks, trailheads, and quiet rural roads. His van wasn't just transportation, it was his base of operations. Inside, he kept supplies organized with meticulous care, blankets folded tightly, tools arranged in precise rows, food stored in ways that extended its shelf life. The van was cramped and worn, but it reflected the only aspect of his life where he remained disciplined. Hilton treated the forest like a vast map only he knew how to read. He memorized trail systems as though they were arteries of a living city. He learned where water sources flowed even in drought, which areas stayed deserted during off-season months, and where campgrounds offered both cover and easy escape routes. Rangers occasionally noticed him lingering longer than most visitors, but he was polite, responsive, and old enough to be dismissed as a harmless wanderer. What nobody realized was that Hilton observed them too. He watched rangers as carefully as he watched hikers, noting their schedules, patrol patterns, and the blind spots of their routines. His respect for the forest did not extend to the people who tended it. In his mind, he knew the landscape better than they ever would. He believed he belonged there more than they did. Hilton's existence became a cycle of motion and stillness. When he needed money, he returned briefly to towns or took small jobs. But as soon as he earned enough to get by, he disappeared again into the woods. He slept in the van most nights, leaving it only when he felt safe or when the weather forced him deeper into isolated pockets of the forest. To other hikers, he looked like an aging outdoorsman, thin, graying, always wearing the same faded clothes, often carrying nothing more than a backpack or a water bottle. He approached people occasionally to ask for food, money, or conversation, but even these interactions felt strange. His politeness seemed rehearsed. His curiosity felt forced. And his gaze lingered too long, as though evaluating people rather than speaking to them. He had a peculiar habit of stepping out from behind trees or emerging suddenly from side paths, startling hikers without meaning to. He moved quietly, sometimes too quietly, like someone who had spent years learning how not to be noticed. And the forest, with its soft ground and dense cover, made it easy for him to appear and vanish without a sound. As the seasons shifted, Hilton's reliance on the woods deepened. Winters were harsh, but he endured them with stubborn focus. Summers were humid and thick, but he knew how to find shade and water. The forest wasn't just his refuge, it was the environment in which he felt most competent, most secure, most in control. He developed routines that mirrored the patterns of wildlife. He woke before dawn, taking advantage of the quiet hours before hikers began to stir. He moved at dusk, when the fading light masked his presence. He avoided weekends, holidays, and peak hiking seasons. He preferred days when the weather kept crowds away. And the more time he spent alone, the more his perspective on hikers began to change. At first, he saw them as minor annoyances, noisy intruders disrupting the solitude he cherished. But gradually, they became symbols of everything he resented: people with expensive gear, stable homes to return to, cars that didn't break down, families who cared where they were. To him, they represented the life he believed he deserved but never achieved. The wilderness became the only place where he felt equal to others, or superior. While hikers moved through the landscape with excitement or leisure, Hilton navigated it with the confidence of someone who believed he understood its dangers better than they did. If they got lost, he would know how to find his way. If their supplies ran out, he knew how to improvise. If they were scared at night, he saw the darkness as familiar. This superiority simmered quietly, unacknowledged even to himself. It fed into his resentment toward hikers who moved carelessly through areas he considered sacred. He watched them leave trash behind, disturb wildlife, or speak loudly in places he believed deserved reverence. Each of these moments deepened the fracture between his world and theirs. He began talking to himself more, his monologues growing longer, more intense, more agitated. He muttered about hikers being spoiled, about how they didn't respect nature, about how society had turned them into weak, unaware wanderers. He vented his frustrations into the trees, speaking words nobody else could hear but that he repeated often enough for them to form a narrative inside his mind. A narrative that justified his anger. A narrative that framed him as the lone guardian of the woods. A narrative that made others seem like trespassers. His self-image evolved in a direction that was both grandiose and deeply fragile. Some days he saw himself as a misunderstood outdoorsman, living an honest, rugged life. Other days he imagined himself as a kind of enforcer of the wilderness, someone who understood the land better than anyone else and therefore believed he had authority over those who entered it. These mental shifts were subtle, but they mattered. They shaped how he viewed strangers. They shaped how he interpreted innocent actions as provocations. They shaped how he justified resentment that had no basis in reality. And in this isolation, in these stretches of quiet forest where nobody challenged him, nobody grounded him, nobody connected with him, Gary Hilton's worldview curled inward, hardening into something brittle and dangerous. The forest gave him peace. It gave him purpose. But it also gave him space to build a belief system with no opposition and no boundaries. A belief system in which he was the only one who understood the rules. And soon, that belief would guide him to choices that would change the quiet woods forever. As Hilton's identity became more deeply intertwined with the wilderness, he began drifting into a lifestyle that was less survival, and more ritual. His days followed patterns familiar only to him: rhythms shaped by environmental cues, internal anxieties, and a growing fixation on controlling the space around him. The forest wasn't just where he lived, it was where he defined his worth. And that sense of identity, fragile as it was, became a driving force behind his behavior. He developed small, meticulous habits that gave him the illusion of order. Each morning, he organized the contents of his van with almost military precision, food stored in identical containers, tools arranged by shape and purpose, clothing folded into rigid squares. Even trash had a specific place. There was something ceremonial about the way he handled his possessions, as though these actions kept the chaos of his mind at bay. These small routines were his anchors, preventing his drifting thoughts from spinning loose. But these routines also masked a deeper unraveling. His isolation made it impossible for anyone to witness the gradual decline in his mental state. He existed in a vacuum. There were no friends to question changes in his behavior, no coworkers to notice shifts in his mood, no family members to ground him when he began spiraling. The woods became a mirror that reflected nothing back at him, only silence. And in that silence, his thoughts grew louder. He spent hours wandering trails with no clear destination, muttering to himself about the world's injustices. His grievances took on a strange, circular logic. He blamed society for his failures, hikers for their confidence, and strangers for their happiness. Each irritation reinforced the same conclusion: he deserved more than he had. And the forest, in its vastness, seemed to agree with him by reflecting none of his flaws back at him. It asked nothing of him and offered no resistance. As these thoughts hardened, Hilton began imagining scenarios where he confronted the hikers he resented. He fantasized about teaching them lessons, forcing them to respect the woods, stripping them of their arrogance, showing them the limits of their strength. These fantasies were not yet violent, but they were rooted in domination, the desire to reclaim control he felt he'd lost everywhere else in life. He walked the forests not merely as a wanderer but with the creeping belief that he belonged there more than anyone else. And that mindset changed how he saw hikers who crossed his path. He judged their gear, expensive boots, bright backpacks, high-tech water systems. He saw these things not as tools but as symbols of privilege, proof that they lived structured, supported lives he no longer had access to. He resented their comfort. He resented their confidence. And on some days, when his frustration smoldered hotter than usual, he resented their very presence in the spaces he claimed as his own. One characteristic that became increasingly apparent was Hilton's obsession with control. Control over his environment. Control over conversations. Control over his own narrative. Whenever something, or someone, disrupted this sense of order, even in the smallest way, it threw him off balance. A stranger's comment, a ranger's question, a hiker passing too close to his campsite, these minor interactions could send him into hours of internal agitation. Yet he hid this instability remarkably well. Decades of drifting had taught him how to mask his emotions when necessary. If someone approached him, he knew how to soften his tone. If a ranger asked about his stay, he smiled politely. If a hiker offered him food, he accepted with thanks. He understood that visibility was dangerous. And becoming memorable was a risk he could not afford. His life became a balance between being present enough to survive, and invisible enough to remain unchallenged. And invisibility was something he mastered. People forgot him minutes after meeting him. He left no lasting impression, no identifying traits, no reason for anyone to recall his face. In a world increasingly filled with hikers, tourists, and travelers, Hilton became a ghost in the woods, drifting between trees, campsites, and parking lots without leaving a trace. But the forest didn't just offer him invisibility. It offered him opportunity. Increasingly, he studied hikers not just out of resentment or habit but out of fascination. He took note of who traveled alone. Who carried heavy gear. who seemed tired, who appeared inexperienced. He noticed patterns, when certain trails were busiest, when they were empty, when hikers were most vulnerable. These observations began to take on a predatory rhythm long before he acted on them. He didn't see himself as a predator yet, not consciously. But the groundwork was forming. There were small signs, moments when he lingered too long watching hikers set up tents, or when he followed someone down a trail a little farther than necessary. Moments when he stepped closer to strangers than they realized, testing how aware they were of their surroundings. These were behaviors people shrugged off as odd but harmless. But the truth was far darker. Hilton was rehearsing. He was learning how close he could get without being noticed. How long he could linger without being confronted. How far into the forest he could walk before someone began to feel uncomfortable. And through these rehearsals, he discovered something that changed everything. Most people never looked behind them. This realization ignited something in him, a spark of possibility. Because if they didn't look, they wouldn't see him coming. And if they didn't see him coming, he controlled everything. This dynamic fed into his growing obsession with dominance. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of power. Not over society, not over employers, not over a life that had repeatedly failed him, but over individuals who wandered unknowingly into his world. As his fantasies grew darker, they also grew more detailed. He imagined scenarios where he stopped hikers on isolated trails. Where he used intimidation to make them comply. Where he regained a sense of power he believed the world had stolen from him. These fantasies weren't accompanied by guilt, only by a strange sense of satisfaction. But even then, he did not act. Not yet. Because Hilton understood that one mistake, one loud noise, one alert hiker, one unexpected witness, could destroy the careful invisibility he had cultivated. And so the forest became a training ground. A place where he tested boundaries, refined control, and waited for circumstances to align perfectly. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't force what wasn't ready. He waited. And the forest waited with him, silent, patient, complicit in its indifference. By the time this chapter of his life drew to a close, one truth had become clear. Gary Michael Hilton was no longer simply living in the woods. He was becoming something shaped by them, sharpened by isolation, hardened by resentment, and emboldened by a growing belief that the wilderness had chosen him, in its own quiet way, to enforce its rules. And soon, he would act on that belief. Chapter 5, Shifting Intentions, From Wanderer to Watcher. There comes a moment in the lives of certain predators when their fantasy world, the one they've nurtured in secret, protected from scrutiny, and fed with resentment, begins to cross into reality. For Gary Michael Hilton, that shift didn't happen in a dramatic flash or sudden explosion of violence. Instead, it crept forward slowly, almost quietly, like a shadow sliding across the forest floor at dusk. By now, Hilton was no longer just a drifter in the woods. He was a man studying his environment with purpose. The trails he walked weren't simply paths of solitude, they were observation points. Every hiker became a moving variable, every piece of gear a detail to memorize, every isolated bend a point of vulnerability. And Hilton, who once wandered aimlessly, began walking with intention, pausing, watching, listening, and storing information in a mind increasingly shaped by predation. One of the earliest signs of this shift came not from what he did, but from what he stopped doing. Hilton no longer tried to engage in friendly conversation with hikers. He no longer lingered near campsites hoping for scraps of food or small talk. He withdrew even further, choosing instead to hide in natural cover, behind tree lines, within brush, perched on higher ground where he could observe without detection. He watched hikers with the concentration of someone studying prey, tracking their posture, their awareness, their patterns. He paid close attention to those who appeared comfortable, the experienced hikers, because he saw in them a level of confidence that irritated him. But he focused more heavily on those who appeared lost, tired, or distracted. These were the ones who moved too slowly, looked down at their feet too often, or stopped frequently to adjust their backpacks. In a particularly telling moment, one recounted later by a hiker who narrowly avoided becoming a target, Hilton stood quietly just off a trail, half hidden by trees. The hiker initially saw only movement, then realized a man was watching him with an unnervingly blank expression. When the hiker greeted him, Hilton didn't respond. He didn't even nod. He just stared, as if analyzing whether the man posed a threat or an opportunity. The hiker sensed something was wrong. He moved quickly, and he didn't look back. Had he looked back, he might have seen Hilton step onto the trail and trace his footsteps for several yards before disappearing again. This emerging behavior revealed two critical shifts in Hilton's mindset. 1. He was testing boundaries. 2. He was studying reactions. If hikers noticed him, he retreated. If they didn't, he followed longer. Every encounter became a quiet experiment. The forest allowed him the freedom to test these behaviors without consequences. Unlike city streets, where a man staring too long or following someone would draw attention, the woods offered privacy. Noise was swallowed by the trees. Footsteps were muffled by pine needles. The silence acted like a veil, concealing the subtle progression of a hunter learning his craft. One of Hilton's growing obsessions centered around the concept of timing. He noted what time hikers started their routes, when they turned around, when the trails emptied, and when the forest became still. He realized that early mornings and late afternoons were the ideal windows, times when rangers were distracted, casual hikers stayed home, and only the most dedicated ventured out. These patterns fed into a deeper strategy. He began imagining how long it would take before someone noticed a missing hiker. Hours? A day? Longer? The remoteness of the woods fascinated him, the way the environment itself could hide things, swallow things. The riverbanks, the ravines, the thick undergrowth all seemed like parts of a natural machine designed to erase footprints, dampen sound, and buy him time. His fantasies no longer involved vague confrontations. They became structured scenarios. He imagined stopping a hiker at a bend in the trail, ordering them to step off the path. He imagined taking control of their gear, forcing compliance through intimidation and the sheer unpredictability he carried. He imagined leading them into a deeper pocket of the woods, a place where the sound of their fear would dissolve into the wind. These fantasies were rehearsed so frequently that, eventually, they no longer felt like fantasies at all. They felt like plans. Plans waiting for the perfect moment. During this period, Hilton's relationship with his own aging body added another layer to his mindset. His knees ached. His energy waned faster. He wasn't the strong, lean wanderer he once had been. But instead of discouraging him, this physical decline fueled a sense of urgency. He believed that if he didn't assert himself now, if he didn't prove his strength, his superiority, his control, he never would. This growing desperation blended with entitlement, creating a psychological cocktail that intensified his fantasies even further. And as this desperation grew, so did his resourcefulness. Hilton began testing the limits of his environment in ways that suggested he was rehearsing for something bigger. He walked off-trail to see how far he could move without leaving obvious footprints. He timed how long it took to drag heavy branches, imagining the weight of something else. He studied which sounds carried far and which ones were swallowed quickly by the forest. He noted whether hikers kept their phones on them, or if they tucked them in their packs, making them harder to reach in moments of panic. He learned which trails had cell phone dead zones. Which creeks drowned the sound of footsteps. Which hills offered optimal vantage points. Which campsites were too remote for screams to travel. Every detail mattered. Every observation was stored away. Every moment of solitude fueled the momentum toward something irreversible. This progression wasn't visible from the outside. Rangers still saw him as a strange, aging man living out of his van. Hikers still saw him as an odd but harmless drifter. No one realized they were brushing past a mind calibrating itself toward violence. But internally, Hilton's world was changing. The fantasies that once provided escape now demanded action. The forest that once offered peace now whispered possibilities. And the hikers he once resented now represented something else entirely. Targets. He didn't yet know exactly when he would act. But he knew where. He knew how. And the idea of choosing a moment, the perfect moment, began to consume him with quiet anticipation. Soon, he would stop imagining. He would stop practicing. And the forest would no longer simply hide him. It would become complicit in his actions. As Hilton's fantasies deepened, the distinction between thought and intention blurred. What had once been idle resentment evolved into a structured obsession. He was no longer simply irritated by hikers, he felt provoked by their presence, as if they were trespassers in a world he believed he was entitled to control. And once he began framing the forest as his territory, everything changed. His daily observations grew more deliberate. He began mapping specific trails by memory, noting the routes that offered the fewest escape points or the most secluded pockets. He knew where cell service vanished, where bends in the trail created blind spots, and where thick foliage muffled sound. These details weren't casual observations. They were pieces of a plan forming slowly in the shadows of his mind. The forest, once a refuge, now became a chessboard. Every hiker he watched fit into one of two categories. Those he believed he could control, and those he couldn't. And Hilton devoted far more attention to the former category. He noticed that people hiking alone often moved with a sense of vulnerability, glancing over their shoulders more frequently. Clutching their straps tighter. Some were confident, sure, but confidence meant little if they were lost or tired. Hilton became adept at noticing the little signs, a limp, a sagging shoulder, an unsteady step. Even the way a person shifted their weight told him how fatigued they were. He studied their packs with equal interest. A heavy pack meant slower movement. A lightweight pack meant fewer supplies, less preparation. He could tell immediately whether someone was carrying food, water, or equipment to defend themselves. Most weren't. Most hikers underestimated the forest. And Hilton built his confidence on their complacency. He began returning to certain trails at specific times, scanning for familiar faces. He wasn't looking for friendship, he was testing consistency. If someone returned to the same trail every weekend, he noticed. If they preferred isolated areas or hiked deeper into the woods than others, he made note of it. These details formed patterns, and patterns were crucial to predictability. Predictability, in Hilton's mind, meant control. And control was exactly what he craved. As he refined these observations, another change emerged, an internal dialogue that became more aggressive, more domineering. He muttered under his breath as he walked, rehearsing what he might say to a hiker if he stopped them. The imagined conversations weren't polite or neutral. They were commands. Demands. Statements designed to assert his authority. Stop right there. Turn around. Don't speak. Do what I tell you. These scripts played on a loop in his mind until they began to feel rehearsed. He spoke them with a tone of absolute conviction, as though simply saying the words made him more powerful. And eventually, practicing these lines wasn't enough. He wanted to test them, not in fantasy, but in reality. The first attempts were small, nearly imperceptible. He would block part of the trail with his body, watching how hikers reacted when they realized they needed to step around him. Some apologized politely. Some gave him wary looks. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Hilton studied each reaction with meticulous attention, judging whether they feared confrontation or dismissed him entirely. The ones who ignored him sparked anger. The ones who seemed intimidated sparked something else. Possibility. There were moments when he stepped onto the trail just as someone approached, forcing them to slow down or adjust their path. If they startled easily, he tucked the detail away like ammunition. If they confronted him, even mildly, he memorized their face and avoided them. He sought not challenge, but dominance. Soon, these subtle tests weren't enough. He escalated. On more than one occasion, hikers later recalled feeling watched, sensing someone's footsteps behind them, only to turn and see Hilton standing completely still, as if he'd been caught in the act but refused to acknowledge it. His blank stare unnerved them, but his age and weathered appearance made him seem more odd than threatening. They didn't realize they had just encountered a predator rehearsing the prelude to violence. But Hilton did. And the success of these rehearsals emboldened him. He learned that most hikers didn't trust their instincts. They shrugged off their unease. They rationalized it away. They assumed they were imagining things. This realization tightened Hilton's grip on his fantasies. If people doubted their intuition, he could exploit that doubt. If they hesitated even for a moment, he controlled the moment. Another pivotal shift occurred when Hilton began lingering near trailhead parking lots. These areas provided him with a new set of observations: which cars belonged to which hikers, who traveled alone, how long they typically stayed on the trail, and whether anyone checked on them. He memorized license plates, stickers on bumpers, the wear patterns on tires. He became obsessed with predicting how long a particular car would remain. If a lone hiker parked for several hours, Hilton noted the exact time they left and the approximate time he expected them to return. He studied the distance between cars, the visibility of the lot from the trailhead, and whether rangers or other hikers regularly passed through. He was building a blueprint, one detail at a time, without anyone suspecting a thing. During this period, Hilton's resentment hardened into something darker: entitlement. He believed the forest belonged to him. He believed hikers didn't respect the land. And most dangerously, he believed he was justified in taking action. This internal justification manifested in ways that hinted at the violence to come. He began carrying knives more often, cleaning and sharpening them with meticulous care. He reorganized the inside of his van to make room for ropes, tarps, and tools. He practiced tying knots, not camping knots, but knots designed for restraint. There was no immediate victim. No dramatic turning point. No moment when the decision was consciously made. It was a gradual, chilling transition. The final shift from imagining domination to preparing for it. The preparations brought him a sense of calm. For the first time in years, he felt a direction, a purpose. The waiting no longer felt passive, it felt strategic. And then, one day, something inside him quietly clicked. A hiker passed him on a secluded trail, alone, tired, unaware. Hilton watched them walk by, every sense alert. He measured their pace, their distraction, the weight of their pack. And for a split second, he stepped forward as if to follow. But held himself back. Not yet. But soon. Because by now, the line between watcher and predator had blurred beyond repair. The forest had shaped him. Isolation had hardened him. Fantasy had consumed him. And the next chapter of his life, the chapter the world would remember, was preparing to unfold in the silence of the trees. Chapter 6, The First Victim, A Predator Steps Out of the Shadows. The transition from fantasy to action often happens in the quietest moments, when the world around a predator seems still, when the internal storm finally finds a crack wide enough to slip through. For Gary Michael Hilton, that moment arrived not with a scream or a sudden burst of rage, but with the same eerie calm that had enveloped his life for decades. It began on a morning thick with mist, the kind that hangs low between the trees and blurs the line between reality and imagination. Hilton had been moving through the forest for hours, drifting between well-worn paths and narrow, hidden cuts through the woods. He wasn't searching for anything specific, or at least, that's what he told himself. But his body moved with a kind of subconscious direction, guided by routines he had repeated enough to feel instinctive. His van was parked a mile away at a trailhead he had scouted many times before. He knew the comings and goings of that parking lot better than some rangers. He knew which hikers liked early starts, which trails were popular on certain days of the week, and which routes offered the highest chance of isolation. And that morning, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel so directly until now: readiness. He followed a narrow stretch of trail bordered by thick underbrush, a part of the forest where visibility dropped to mere yards. This was one of his favorite sections, quiet, unpredictable, and winding just enough to hide whatever waited around the bend. The air was cool, the soil damp, the atmosphere dense with silence. Hilton liked the silence. It made him feel powerful. He heard footsteps long before he saw the hiker. Soft, steady, rhythmic. Someone walking alone. Someone confident enough to keep a consistent pace. He paused, stepping just off the trail, letting the foliage swallow him whole. His breathing slowed. His thoughts narrowed. And the years of wandering, observing, rehearsing, finally condensed into a single point of focus. A woman entered view, moving with a natural ease, her pack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't scanning the trail. She wasn't aware of the man watching her from just feet away. Hilton felt something shift inside him, not excitement, not rage, but a chilling sense of inevitability. As if everything in his life had led him to this exact moment. He stepped forward. Not enough to be seen, but enough to feel the gravity of the decision settling into his bones. The woman passed within arm's reach. He could smell the faint scent of her shampoo, see strands of hair caught in the straps of her pack, hear the steady rhythm of her breathing. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. And something quiet inside him said, "This is it." But he didn't move. Not yet. Her footsteps continued, fading slowly along the trail. And Hilton stayed frozen in place, feeling his heartbeat settle back into a slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't feel shame. He didn't feel fear. He simply felt incomplete. As though he had taken the first step toward something irreversible, yet hadn't committed fully. He followed her at a distance, careful to keep his steps silent, his presence hidden. She stopped occasionally to adjust her pack or take in the scenery. Hilton studied her posture, her habits, the slight tilt of her head when she listened for nearby wildlife. He observed with the intensity of a man preparing not for conversation, but for control. When she reached a fork in the trail, a narrow offshoot that led deeper into the forest, he knew she'd made a mistake. Few hikers took that route. Fewer returned quickly. She lingered for a moment, reading a small wooden sign, before turning down the lesser-used path. Hilton exhaled slowly. Everything was aligning, the isolation, the distance from the main trail, the lack of witnesses. The forest around him felt still, as though holding its breath. He followed closer now, no longer concerned about being seen. He watched her shoulders tense slightly, sensing perhaps that she wasn't alone, but not enough to trigger alarm. Hilton's presence was a shadow, close enough to touch, yet invisible in her mind. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't chaos. This was strategy. Hilton's steps were calculated, his breathing controlled, his thoughts chillingly calm. The fantasies he had rehearsed so many times began merging with the reality unfolding in front of him. He imagined stepping forward, imagined taking command, imagined forcing her into the deeper parts of the woods where the silence swallowed everything. But again, he hesitated. The hesitation wasn't fear. It was precision. He wanted the first act to be perfect, clean, controlled, unchallenged. He wanted to feel the power he'd imagined for so long, and he wanted nothing to disrupt it. So he waited. He watched. He followed her until the trail narrowed even further, until the trees closed overhead like a canopy of witnesses, until he knew with absolute certainty that no one was coming. And then, as she paused to sip from her water bottle, Hilton stepped fully onto the trail behind her. She didn't hear him. He stood there, motionless, studying her the way a hunter studies an animal in its final moment of calm. His mind narrowed to a single point: take control. The script he'd rehearsed so many times hovered at the edge of his tongue. His hands flexed. His eyes locked onto her. And something cold, something monstrous, something long dormant began to rise inside him. This was the moment where fantasy became intention. This was the moment where the forest's silence shifted from peaceful to predatory. This was the moment before the first attack. And the man who had wandered, watched, rehearsed, and waited, was finally ready to act. The forest had never felt so still. As Hilton stood behind the woman on the narrow trail, it was as though the world had muted itself. No birdsong. No breeze stirring the leaves. Even the distant hum of insects felt quieter, like the woods were holding their breath. He felt a strange clarity settle over him, a cold, focused awareness unlike anything he'd known before. For decades, his thoughts had been a chaotic tangle of resentment, loneliness, and fantasy. But here, now, they aligned with frightening precision. He took a step forward. It was deliberate, controlled, and almost gentle, as though he wanted the earth beneath his foot to accept his presence, not expose it. The woman didn't hear him at first. She was too busy adjusting the straps on her pack, her attention fixed on the routine motion of tightening buckles. Hilton watched every detail, the way her hands moved, the shift of her weight, the slight bend in her posture. He spoke softly, a quiet command shaped from years of rehearsal. "Don't turn around." The words were calm. Measured. Spoken not with rage, but with authority. She froze. Her body stiffened, breath catching in her throat. Hilton saw the tension ripple through her shoulders, the instinctive fear of someone realizing they are no longer alone. For a moment, she didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't even breathe. And in that suspended silence, Hilton felt something powerful surge inside him. Not excitement, but control. Pure, absolute control. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he stood just a few feet behind her. He could see the faint tremor in her hands. He could sense her uncertainty, the part of her trying to determine whether the voice behind her belonged to a threat, a stranger, or a nightmare she never imagined she'd face in the woods. "Don't scream," he added quietly. Again, the tone was calm. Almost soothing. But beneath the softness was an unwavering command, the voice of someone who expected obedience. The woman slowly raised her hands, showing they were empty. Her breathing quickened, shallow and uneven. Hilton didn't rush. He didn't bark orders. He let the silence wrap around them like a shroud, forcing her to wait, to wonder, to imagine. He'd learned long ago that fear grew best in silence. When he finally spoke again, his words were chillingly rehearsed. "We're going to walk," he said. "No sudden movements. No talking." He waited for her to nod before motioning with his hand. She obeyed, stepping carefully off the trail and onto the uneven ground beyond it. Hilton followed closely behind, his breathing controlled, his mind locked into a state of laser focus. They moved deeper into the woods, away from the beaten path, away from the world, away from any chance of help. The forest grew thicker, darker. Branches clawed at their clothes. Leaves crunched beneath their feet. Every snapped twig echoed like a warning swallowed by the trees. Hilton guided her with the ease of someone who had walked these hidden routes many times before. He knew exactly where he was going, a secluded pocket of forest he had scouted days earlier. A place where sound didn't travel. A place where no one ever wandered accidentally. A place that felt like it belonged to him alone. As they reached the small clearing he'd chosen, Hilton felt a strange mixture of calm and anticipation wash over him. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't chaotic. It was, in his mind, inevitable. A natural progression of the fantasies he'd carried for years. A moment he believed he'd been preparing for his whole life. The woman stood trembling, her eyes darting between the trees as though searching for an escape she knew didn't exist. Hilton watched her quietly, studying her distress with an unsettling detachment. He didn't yell. He didn't rush. His control wasn't derived from force alone, it came from the psychological dominance he exerted simply by being calm when she was terrified. "Sit down," he instructed. His voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It felt almost like a request, polite, composed, horrifyingly normal. She complied, lowering herself onto the damp ground, hands trembling in her lap. Hilton remained standing, towering over her, the forest framing him like a silhouette carved from the trees themselves. At that moment, Hilton experienced something he'd long imagined but never fully understood until now. A sense of ownership. Not over the forest, he'd felt that for years, but over this moment, this person, this unfolding reality. The shift felt permanent. He asked her questions in a soft tone, not because he cared about the answers, but because he wanted to hear the fear in her voice. He watched her struggle to speak, watched her eyes dart downward, watched every sign of her submission. This, to him, was confirmation, proof that his fantasies had finally manifested into control. But as he continued to assert dominance, something else flickered across his expression, a strange, unsettling calm that bordered on emptiness. Hilton wasn't driven by rage or pleasure. He was driven by a need to fulfill the narrative he had constructed in the quiet corners of his mind. A narrative where he was no longer invisible, no longer powerless, no longer forgotten. The forest, silent and indifferent, felt like a witness. Hours passed. What transpired in that clearing would later be pieced together through fragments, Hilton's own admissions, forensic evidence, and the grim discoveries that followed. But one truth was undeniable. When Hilton walked out of the woods that day, he crossed a threshold he could never return from. The man who entered the forest was a drifter, an observer, a wanderer shaped by bitterness and isolation. The man who left it was a predator. A predator who had tasted control, and who now understood exactly how easy it was to take. The silence of the woods, once comforting, now carried a different feeling, not peace, but potential. Because Hilton knew something else now, something that solidified fully as he stepped back onto the trail, adjusting his clothes, steadying his breathing. He could do it again. And the forest would keep his secrets. Chapter 7, Emerging Patterns, Confidence After the First Kill. The hours after a predator takes a life reveal more about them than the act itself. For some, there is panic, a rush of adrenaline followed by regret, fear, or disorientation. But for Gary Michael Hilton, walking out of the forest after his first kill, there was only stillness. A strange, heavy stillness that settled over him like a blanket. He moved slowly along the trail, every step deliberate. His breathing was calm, his posture steady, as if he had just finished a long hike rather than something far more disturbing. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't pause to listen for voices or footsteps. He didn't check the path behind him for signs of pursuit. It was as though he believed he was invisible, a ghost drifting through the wilderness he considered his own. The forest felt different now. It no longer surrounded him as a refuge or a companion. It enveloped him like a cocoon, sealing him off from the world, protecting him, absorbing the evidence of what had happened. The trees seemed to lean inward, the branches forming a canopy that sheltered his retreat. Hilton felt comfort in this silence. Validation. Even triumph. This calm wasn't confidence in the traditional sense. It wasn't bravado or excitement. It was something deeper, darker, and more unsettling, a certainty that he had finally become the version of himself he had long imagined. The years of resentment, the fantasies of control, the rehearsed commands, they had all crystallized into something real. Something irreversible. As he approached his van, the familiar, worn vehicle felt transformed. It was no longer just shelter or transportation. It was an extension of his control, a mobile cocoon. That allowed him to carry the forest with him, even when he drove back toward civilization. The van was quiet, dim, and meticulously organized, just the way he liked it. Hilton slid into the driver's seat with a slow exhale, gripping the steering wheel as if anchoring himself. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel fear. He felt aligned. For the first time in years, maybe decades, his internal world didn't feel fractured. There was a disturbing coherence in him now, a sense that the act he had committed had clicked something into place. A piece of his mind that had always felt loose, broken, or uncertain now fit perfectly into the puzzle of his identity. The fantasies that once tormented him were no longer fantasies. The power he once imagined was no longer theoretical. The deep resentment he carried now had an outlet. That sense of alignment, however twisted, brought him an eerie clarity. As he drove away from the trailhead, he replayed the events in his mind, not with panic, but with analysis. He evaluated every detail, the timing, the distance from the main trail, the woman's reactions, the path they walked, the spot he chose. He wasn't reliving the violence. He was assessing the efficiency. Hilton thought like a man studying a map of an unfamiliar city, noting wrong turns, missed opportunities, and potential shortcuts. He critiqued himself with meticulous care, identifying the moments he could refine. In his mind, the first kill wasn't a climax. It was a rehearsal. He noticed that his voice had been steady, but perhaps too soft. That the location was secluded, but could have been deeper. That the hiker had complied, but partly out of confusion. He wanted fear to be immediate next time. He wanted control to be absolute. He wanted the moment to unfold exactly as he envisioned it. This wasn't excitement. It was improvement. The more he analyzed, the stronger his sense of control grew. And that control became intoxicating, not in a frantic, impulsive way, but in a calm, methodical way that made him feel superior to everyone else in the world. He believed he had outsmarted society. Outmaneuvered hikers. Outpaced law enforcement. And outgrown the limitations of his former self. But the most dangerous shift was internal. He no longer saw himself as a drifter who occasionally passed through the forest. He now saw himself as a figure who operated above it. A force of nature. A presence the forest itself concealed. He felt untouchable. In the days following the murder, Hilton didn't hide or withdraw. He didn't flee the area or avoid public places. Instead, he slipped right back into his normal routines, visiting gas stations, chatting briefly with clerks, blending into parking lots like a forgettable shadow. His calm demeanor made him practically invisible. No one noticed anything strange. No one saw the cold heaviness behind his eyes. No one suspected the storm that had begun inside him. He returned to the same forest trails several times, revisiting the paths he had walked with the victim. Not because he feared discovery, but because he wanted to understand every part of the process. He examined the trail with a critic's eye, searching for times of highest isolation, listening to how sound traveled at different hours, learning the patterns of other hikers. He realized something important: he felt no danger returning to the scene. He felt no fear of being caught. The forest protected him. That sense of protection became a cornerstone of his escalating behavior. He began to believe the woods themselves justified his actions, that the natural world rewarded those with the strength to dominate others. This delusional bond he formed with the environment blurred the line between rational thought and obsession. He wasn't just hiding in the forest now. He felt claimed by it. And once he believed the forest had claimed him, he believed it endorsed him. The idea grew roots inside his mind. If the world refused to give him control, the forest would. If society overlooked him, the forest would make him significant. If people didn't respect him, the forest would allow him to take respect by force. This belief expanded quickly, spreading through every corner of his thoughts. Soon, he wasn't just reflecting on the first kill, he was imagining the next. And unlike the first time, there was no hesitation. No moment of doubt. No internal debate. The first kill had answered the only question that mattered to him. Could he do it? The answer had been yes. Now he wanted to do it the right way. His way. And in that quiet, chilling certainty, Gary Michael Hilton began searching, not for a victim, but for an opportunity. Because now, he knew exactly what he was capable of. In the days and weeks after the first killing, something inside Gary Hilton settled into place, a sense of structure he had been missing his entire life. His thoughts, once fragmented and restless, now moved with direction. His emotions, once volatile, now felt anchored by the calm certainty of what he had done. The act had not brought chaos into his life. It had eliminated it. He didn't obsess over the violence itself. He obsessed over the control. That control lingered with him in the most mundane moments. When he stood in line at a store, he felt taller. When he walked past people on sidewalks, he felt calmer. When he sat alone eating cheap food out of a plastic container in his van, he felt more composed, more capable, more aligned with the identity that had been forming inside him for years. In a strange, chilling way, the murder didn't fracture his reality, it stabilized it. But what struck him most was how easily the world continued around him without noticing. He watched people live their normal lives, families buying groceries, hikers preparing backpacks, clerks sweeping gas station floors. Nobody suspected him. Nobody looked at him twice. He blended into the background with effortless invisibility. And this invisibility didn't make him feel small. It made him feel powerful. He realized he could stand inches away from people who would never guess what he had done. The secret he carried didn't isolate him, it elevated him, in his own mind. He felt like he knew something the world didn't, like he had tapped into a truth inaccessible to ordinary people. This delusion grew roots. He started viewing hikers not as independent individuals but as pieces of a larger pattern, a natural cycle he believed he had the right to intervene in. The forest, in his distorted worldview, wasn't just a place. It was a stage. A system. A world that operated according to rules he now felt entitled to shape. And slowly, his thoughts shifted from analyzing the past to strategizing the future. He returned to the trails, walking them with a predator's stillness. Each step felt deliberate. Each pause felt strategic. He wasn't wandering anymore. He was hunting, though the hunt had not yet found a target. He watched hikers the way a scientist observes experiments, evaluating their gait, their awareness, their stamina. He noted which ones wore headphones, which ones kept their phones buried in their packs, which ones hiked alone despite weather warnings or late afternoon hours. Every detail mattered, and Hilton absorbed them all. But he wasn't rushing. He wanted the next act to be perfect. He rehearsed scenarios in his mind with increasing complexity. If he encountered a hiker near a river, he imagined directing them upstream where the sound drowned out everything else. If he found someone on a ridge line, he pictured moving them to a sloped area where footing was unstable and escape was unlikely. His mind mapped the terrain with an engineer's precision and a predator's intention. The forest became a classroom, and Hilton was its most attentive student. Every fallen branch taught him about camouflage. Every patch of dense brush taught him about blocking sightlines. Every isolated bend in the trail taught him about opportunity. But one part of his strategy remained dominant above all others. Predictability. He wanted someone predictable, someone whose behavior he understood enough to anticipate. And so he looked not for complete strangers, but for patterns. For routine. For repetition. One afternoon, while parked near a popular trailhead, he noticed a woman returning to her car with a small dog. She moved with a tired but steady rhythm, her posture relaxed after the long hike. He watched her as she fed her dog a snack, adjusted her boots, and sat on the back bumper for a moment of rest. Nothing about her seemed unusual. She wasn't carrying expensive gear. She didn't seem inexperienced or careless. What caught Hilton's attention was not who she was, but what she did next. She left. And then she came back the next day. Same trail. Same time. Same routine. Hilton watched from a distance, leaning casually against his van, pretending to dig through supplies as she locked her car and headed toward the trail. She didn't notice him. She didn't notice anyone. And she didn't seem to fear the woods. On the third day, he parked farther away, observing her from the tree line. She followed the same route as before, crossing a wooden footbridge, pausing near a trail marker, adjusting her pack, and walking deeper into the forest with her small dog trotting at her heels. She was predictable. She was consistent. She was confident. And she was alone. All the elements Hilton looked for began aligning. But he didn't follow her that day. He observed. He memorized. He planned. Over the next week, Hilton tracked her routine with increasing precision. He learned how long her hike typically lasted. He learned which days she stayed on the shorter loop. And which days she extended her route. He learned that she rarely encountered other people on her path. The timing of her hike seemed to avoid the crowds perfectly. This was not yet stalking in the legal sense. It was surveillance, careful, intentional, and methodical. And Hilton found himself studying her movements with the same quiet focus he once dedicated to wilderness navigation. In his mind, she became the ideal candidate for what he called a perfect event. But Hilton's imagination didn't stop at logistics. It drifted into justification. He convinced himself that hikers like her were careless, that they failed to respect the forest, that their predictable routines were a sign of arrogance, that they needed to be taught the same lesson he believed he had delivered during his first kill. Each day he watched her, the narrative strengthened. He wasn't hunting her. He was fulfilling a role. The forest, in his delusion, had chosen him to maintain balance. It had given him the eyes to see what others couldn't. It had given him the resolve to act where others were too weak. By the time he decided he would take her, the decision didn't feel abrupt. It felt inevitable. He watched her leave the trail one afternoon, tired, sweaty, unaware, and something inside him clicked. Not with excitement, but with quiet certainty. He knew the exact day he would make his move. He knew the exact spot where he would intercept her. He knew the exact time the trail would be empty. And as he sat in his van that evening, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes, he felt the same eerie calm he had felt after the first kill. The only difference now was that the hesitation was gone. He was no longer becoming a predator. He was one. And the forest, silent, vast, indifferent, seemed ready once again to hide what would happen next. Chapter 8, Escalation, the Second Abduction. The morning Hilton chose to strike wasn't unusual. The sky was overcast, the air thick with moisture, and the forest breathed in slow, muted exhales. Nothing about the day signaled danger, not to the hikers entering the trails, not to the rangers beginning their rounds, and not to the woman he had been watching for days. But for Hilton, the world felt aligned. He woke before dawn, his movements deliberate, guided by a quiet certainty that today was the day. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Everything he did followed a sequence he had refined since the first kill, a series of steps designed to minimize uncertainty and maximize control. He cleaned his knife, checked his supplies, and ensured his van was stocked with water, rope, and the tools he believed were necessary for what he called a clean event. These preparations weren't frantic or emotional. They were ritualistic. The van idled at the trailhead long before she arrived. Hilton parked farther from the main lot this time, partially shielded by trees, angled so he could see without being easily seen. He sat in the driver's seat with his hands resting calmly on the wheel, watching the forest with the stillness of a predator waiting for movement. When her car finally appeared, he didn't smile or react outwardly. But inside, something settled, a sense of confirmation, a belief that the forest had orchestrated this moment as part of a broader pattern only he understood. She stepped out of her car with the same routine he'd memorized over the past week. Adjusting her pack, giving her dog a quick pat, locking the doors, and setting off down the trail with confident strides. She didn't look behind her. She never did. And that consistency, that routine, was exactly what Hilton relied on. He waited a full minute before exiting his van. He didn't grab his pack immediately. Instead, he stood still, listening, letting the sounds of the trail settle, letting her gain enough distance so he could follow without detection. When he began walking, his steps blended with the forest's natural soundscape, each footfall absorbed by the damp earth. Hilton followed her at a distance, keeping her in sight but never close enough to be noticed. He studied her pace, calculating precisely where she would be in 10 minutes, in 20, at the far end of the loop. The trail she favored began wide and open, then narrowed into a tunnel of trees before splitting into two divergent paths, one safe and populated, the other deeper and far less traveled. He knew which one she would take. He had seen her take it every day. And that knowledge filled him with a steady, chilling confidence. The forest thickened around them as she moved deeper into the quieter section of the trail. Hilton's expression hardened, his jaw tightening as the moment approached. He could feel the distance between fantasy and reality shrinking again, the same tightening, the same controlled surge of adrenaline he had felt before the first kill. But this time, the sensation was different. There was no hesitation. No flicker of uncertainty. Only execution. He quickened his pace subtly, closing the gap between them as she reached the first narrow bend. The dog, trotting ahead of her, occasionally stopped to sniff at the ground or wander toward a patch of grass. Hilton's eyes remained fixed on her, but he noted every detail, the dog's size, its leash, its potential to interfere. He didn't panic at the complication. He simply adjusted his plan. She slowed near a cluster of fallen branches, stepping carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. This was the moment Hilton had anticipated, the part of the trail where uneven ground forced hikers to focus on their footing instead of their surroundings. He stepped closer. At first, she didn't sense him. The dog did. Its ears perked up, its head whipping around in his direction, a low growl rising from its throat. The woman paused, turning just slightly, confusion crossing her face. She didn't recognize Hilton. He'd ensured she never got a good look at him during his surveillance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious but polite. Hilton didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stepped fully onto the trail, his posture rigid, his expression blank, the same expression hikers had described as unsettling long before he ever became violent. The woman took a small step backward instinctively. The dog barked, snapping at the air between them. And Hilton, with a sudden but controlled movement, raised his arm in a gesture meant to silence both of them at once. "Don't move," he said. The words were almost identical to those he had used with the first victim, soft, measured, spoken with the calmness of a man rehearsing a line he'd perfected through endless fantasy. The woman froze, her breath hitching, her body tense. The dog continued barking, tugging at its leash, confused but defensive. Hilton's voice remained steady. "Step off the trail." She shook her head slightly, panic beginning to claw its way to the surface. "No, I don't, my dog." "Now," he said, the word quiet but unmistakably final. Fear pulsed through her expression. Hilton watched it, letting the silence magnify her dread. With trembling hands, she guided the dog toward the bushes, stepping off the trail just as he demanded. The dog growled again, pulling against her grip. Hilton's eyes never left her. Not the dog. Not the surroundings. Just her. He waited until she was fully off the path, then moved closer, forcing her deeper between the trees. The dog barked furiously, lunging as much as its leash allowed. Hilton didn't flinch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulling out a length of cord he had prepared in advance. His movements were deliberate, almost clinical. The woman's breath quickened as she realized he wasn't bluffing. "Please, just take whatever, I don't have much." "Quiet," Hilton murmured. The forest swallowed her pleading voice instantly, as though it had been trained to keep his secrets. He took control of the situation with the cold efficiency he had rehearsed over countless imagined scenarios. The dog became the first obstacle, one he neutralized quickly, though never cruelly. Hilton wasn't interested in harming animals. They weren't part of his fantasy. They weren't symbols of the superiority he sought. They were simply variables. And variables could be managed. Once the dog was secured out of reach, Hilton turned his attention back to the woman, his focus absolute, his demeanor unchanged. She was shaking now, her fear no longer contained. He guided her deeper into the woods, her feet stumbling as she tried to maintain balance on the uneven ground. This moment, the exact crossing from trail to forest, was what Hilton had fantasized about most intensely. The moment where control became total. Where fear became palpable. Where the forest became his partner. The deeper they moved, the more her voice faded into small, broken sounds, whimpers of panic, gasps of disbelief, fragmented pleas she knew he wouldn't answer. And Hilton, with his unnervingly calm presence, absorbed every sound like fuel. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel rage. He felt authority. The same authority that had eluded him all his life, at jobs, in relationships, in society, now existed here, in the isolated world of the woods, where no one intervened and no one watched. And as they reached the secluded clearing he had chosen days earlier, Hilton felt the final transformation settle into place. The first kill had been a revelation. The second was confirmation. He wasn't experimenting anymore. He wasn't testing boundaries. He was fulfilling a role he believed belonged to him. And the forest, silent and indifferent, closed around him once again. Ready to hide the next chapter of his darkness. Chapter 9, The Silent Trail, Clues Begin to Surface. The forest held its secrets well. Days passed before anyone noticed something was wrong, and even then, the realization came quietly, not in a form of panic, but in the subtle discomfort that spreads when routine breaks without warning. The woman Hilton had been watching failed to return home that evening. Friends assumed she'd stopped for errands, or that her phone had died, or that she'd gone out for dinner after her hike. She was responsible, predictable, and calm. Nothing in her life hinted at danger. But the next morning her car was still at the trailhead. A park ranger noticed it first, a small SUV parked slightly crooked, as though the driver had arrived in a rush. The ranger didn't panic. Cars were sometimes left overnight when hikers camped deeper in the woods. But something about the placement bothered him. It wasn't in a camping zone. It wasn't in long-term parking. And the windows showed a thin layer of dew that suggested it hadn't moved in a while. He wrote down the license plate just to be safe. When afternoon came and the car was still there, he called it in. That call was the first thread, thin, fragile, almost insignificant, in the growing web that would eventually lead to Gary Michael Hilton. Local deputies arrived, treating the situation with caution but not alarm. People did get lost on trails. Sometimes they sprained ankles, wandered off paths, or underestimated daylight. Search and rescue was routine. But as officers canvassed the parking area, another detail emerged. Her dog wasn't with her. It was nowhere in sight. Most hikers, especially those who came daily, didn't abandon their dogs willingly. That single fact shifted the tone. Officers informed supervisors, volunteers gathered, and soon the forest echoed with the organized calling of her name, voices cutting through the heavy air, ricocheting off the trees, searching for any sign of life. Hilton watched the search from a distance. He wasn't foolish enough to be seen at the trailhead. Instead, he parked several miles away, observing traffic, listening to radio chatter from his small portable scanner, and studying the pattern of vehicles heading into the park. Search teams moved in coordinated shifts, accompanied by dogs, drones, and maps spread across the hoods of sheriff's trucks. Hilton didn't panic. He believed he'd prepared well. But for the first time, he felt something unexpected, curiosity. He wanted to see how they worked, how quickly they mobilized, how they searched, how they tried to reconstruct the last known moments of someone who had vanished. It wasn't emotional fascination. It was strategic. Observing the investigation gave him information he believed he could use later. And he took mental notes on everything. He noticed that search teams always started from the trailhead and moved outward in predictable grids. He noticed that deeper areas of the forest were searched last. He noticed how quickly volunteers grew tired and how easily their voices became strained and directionless as afternoon heat set in. He studied their weaknesses, their patterns, their blind spots. Meanwhile, investigators began constructing a timeline. They called her family. They checked her workplace. They spoke to the ranger who'd seen her car earlier. They obtained security footage from a gas station down the road, and though the footage wasn't perfect, it confirmed the time she'd arrived at the trailhead. But the footage also revealed something else. A white van. Old. Weathered. Parked in the background for only a few seconds before slipping out of frame. No visible plate. No clear identifying marks. Just a van, the kind often ignored, the kind that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Still, investigators noted it. Van sightings in missing persons cases were always flagged. A detective mentioned it casually in a briefing, saying, "It's probably nothing." But in cases like these, nothing often becomes something. They checked similar vehicles in the area. They asked park staff whether anyone had seen a man lingering near the trail. A few hikers recalled a tall, thin man with unkempt hair and a nearly expressionless face. Some remembered him watching people a little too closely. Others recalled nothing specific, just an eerie feeling. Those vague descriptions formed a shadow, not yet a suspect, not yet a theory, but a presence. The search continued for days. Helicopters circled overhead, dipping low as pilots scanned for color, bright clothing, movement, or anything that contrasted with the dense greens and browns of the forest floor. Officers used megaphones. Volunteers spread out. Neighbors brought food and coffee to the search teams. The community rallied because that's what communities do when fear is fresh and hope hasn't yet faded. Hilton watched all of it. He learned how quickly word spread. How people reacted. How social media amplified fear. How law enforcement coordinated across counties. He absorbed every detail, storing the information like a student studying for an exam he intended to take again. And in the middle of the search, something unnerved investigators. Footprints. Not hers, they were too large. Not from a ranger's boot, the pattern didn't match. The prints belonged to a man. Heavy heel, narrow toe, slightly uneven gait. The prints appeared in an area off the main trail, near a section where brush was flattened and broken. The forest had whispered its first clue. Investigators marked the site, photographed the prints, and widened the search radius. They found subtle disturbances, snapped branches, compressed leaves, and unnatural gaps in the underbrush. Nothing definitive. Nothing that could be called evidence. But enough to signal that someone had been there. If the first thread was the abandoned car, this was the second. Small, but undeniable. The dog was found the next day. Alone. Exhausted. Shaking. The discovery fractured the optimism of the search effort. A dog staying with its owner was expected. A dog separated from its owner was not. It suggested struggle, disorientation, or deliberate separation. Rangers crouched beside the dog, gently offering food and water. The animal was frightened, but alive. That was the moment investigators knew they weren't dealing with a typical missing persons case. They were dealing with a predator. And though they didn't know his name yet, they knew this. He was organized. He was prepared. And he had vanished without leaving a trail a normal wanderer could. But Hilton hadn't disappeared. He was simply watching. He observed the teams leave the forest at dusk. He watched the news coverage replay the same grainy footage of her car at the trailhead. He listened to interviews with friends and family. And he noted how, despite the growing urgency, law enforcement still lacked one crucial element. A suspect. He knew the woman's disappearance would make headlines. He knew search efforts would widen. But he also believed he could outthink all of them, not because of genius, but because he had spent his life understanding how people overlook what they don't expect to see. And Gary Hilton, to most strangers, was forgettable, a thin man with unremarkable clothes, a weathered van, and the posture of someone used to sleeping outdoors. He trusted invisibility. He trusted silence. He trusted the forest. But he overlooked one thing. Investigators were starting to connect cases across state lines. And soon, the man who believed he could hide forever would find his secrets pulled from the trees, one clue at a time. As the search entered its fourth day, the optimism that had fueled volunteers began to fade. Forests play tricks on hope, their vastness creates the illusion that someone might still be out there, alive, waiting to be found. But the same vastness also swallows evidence, hides tracks, and muffles cries. Investigators knew that time was no longer on their side. They brought in specialized teams, professionals trained to search dense, unforgiving terrain. They expanded the radius beyond the trail system, combing through miles of uneven ground. They used scent dogs trained specifically for recovery. But no matter how wide the net stretched, the forest seemed to stay silent. Still, the search was not fruitless. A deputy found something subtle but important, a section of brush flattened in a way that suggested someone had dragged weight through it. Not enough to draw immediate conclusions, animals also disturbed brush in similar ways, but enough to stop the deputy in his tracks. He radioed his supervisor. Soon, 3 more officers arrived, studying the pattern with serious eyes. The ground revealed fragments of disturbed soil, as if someone had taken careful steps to conceal movement. An overturned root hinted at pressure, and small twigs were snapped at angles that suggested intentional passage rather than random wildlife activity. Investigators marked the site and continued deeper, fanning out in staggered lines. It was clear that something, or someone, had been there. Meanwhile, the recovered dog was transported to a local vet. The animal was dehydrated and visibly traumatized, but suffered no physical injuries. When officers attempted to walk the dog near the woods again, hoping it might lead them toward a particular direction, the dog refused. It planted its paws firmly in the ground, trembling, tail tucked tightly. Even without words, the message was unmistakable. Whatever had happened in the forest had terrified it. Investigators added this detail to their growing list of observations, and the incident commander addressed the team with a new tone, one that signaled a shift from search and rescue to potential criminal investigation. "We're no longer assuming she's lost," he said. "We're assuming someone else is involved." That announcement changed everything. Search patterns shifted from wide sweeps to targeted grids. They began checking security footage at nearby stores. They reviewed the ranger logs for suspicious behavior. They interviewed hikers who had been on the trail during the previous week. Several recalled a thin, older man with sharp features and a hollow expression. Some described an unsettling feeling when he passed them. None had seen him interact with the missing woman directly. But the descriptions were consistent. A man in his 60s. Thin. Scruffy. Quiet. Driving an old white van. For now, that was all investigators had. But it was more than they realized, it was the first clear silhouette of Gary Michael Hilton. The FBI eventually entered the discussion. Anytime someone vanished from public land, especially in areas spanning multiple jurisdictions, federal involvement became likely. Agents requested copies of all evidence, notes, and witness statements. They observed the search patterns and suggested new ones. They analyzed the shoeprint impressions found near the disturbed brush. And they asked a question that chilled the room. Has anything similar happened before in these woods? Local officers exchanged uncertain glances. There had been disappearances, hikers failing to return, people abandoning campsites unexpectedly, a few cases still unsolved. But nothing had ever definitively pointed to a serial predator. Rural law enforcement often attributed missing hikers to accidents, falls, dehydration, getting lost, animal encounters. Still, as the FBI sifted through old case files, a pattern began to emerge, not in the specifics, but in the suggestive similarities. Older victims. Solo hikers. Forest settings. Few signs of struggle. Evidence faint or absent. When investigators compared notes across county lines, they discovered something even more unsettling. The same type of white van had been reported near other trailheads during other disappearances. None of these sightings were concrete. But together, they formed a whisper of a pattern. Hilton, meanwhile, remained invisible. He drove from one forest to another, sleeping in his van, cooking meals on a camp stove, shaving occasionally at public restrooms, and watching news coverage with an eerie calmness. The missing woman's face appeared on the screen. The search teams. The interviews with her family. The plea for information. Hilton stared at it all with a blank expression. Emotionless. Detached. Analytical. There was no remorse, because he didn't view himself as monstrous. There was no fear, because he believed he'd moved beyond detection. There was only an evolving sense of superiority, a belief that he understood the wilderness more deeply than the officers searching it, more deeply than the civilians walking it, more deeply than society itself. For Hilton, the forest wasn't a hiding place. It was home. And he believed the forest rewarded him for understanding its quiet rules. But the cracks in his invisibility were beginning to show. A hiker came forward saying they saw a disheveled older man talking to himself near the trailhead the week before the disappearance. A gas station clerk recalled a van matching the description parked awkwardly by the pumps, the driver muttering angrily at no one in particular. A dog walker remembered a gaunt man staring a little too long at people passing by. None of these accounts were strong enough to identify him. But together, they narrowed the profile. The FBI's behavioral team created a preliminary sketch of the offender. Male, late 50s to early 60s. White. Thin, possibly malnourished. Likely transient. Comfortable in wilderness environments. Possibly experienced in outdoor survival. Potentially mentally unstable or delusional. Possesses a vehicle capable of long-term habitation. The sketch wasn't a photograph, but it was close, disturbingly close, to Gary Hilton. Detectives posted flyers. Park rangers briefed their teams. Hikers were warned to travel in groups. Local news ran segments urging caution on trails. The fear was quiet, but spreading. And in a dimly lit corner of a remote campsite, Hilton sat alone on a folding chair, sharpening his knife against a whetstone with slow, methodical strokes. The rhythmic scrape of metal echoed softly in the night, blending with the chorus of insects and the rustle of distant leaves. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't fleeing. He believed he had time. But what he didn't realize was that investigators were no longer searching for a missing hiker. They were searching for him. The quiet man they only knew as a van, a shadow, a silhouette in the trees. And the net around him, though invisible to Hilton, had already begun to tighten. Chapter 10, A Net Tightens, Investigators Close In. By the time the search for the missing hiker entered its second week, something had shifted, not in the forest, but in the minds of investigators. What began as a rescue operation was now an active, multi-agency hunt for a predator operating in the wilderness. And though no one knew his name yet, the silhouette of the offender was growing sharper with every day that passed. The FBI formally joined the investigation, bringing additional resources, analysts, and forensic specialists. Their presence added weight to the case, a quiet signal that this disappearance was no longer viewed as an isolated tragedy. They brought maps, behavioral analysis charts, and case files from other states. They asked local authorities to step back and revisit details that might have seemed insignificant at first glance. Patterns, they said, were hiding in plain sight. One agent gathered the small stack of reports about strange men seen along southeastern trail systems. Another pinned photographs of missing hikers to a corkboard, grouping them by geography. A third agent conducted interviews with rangers from different counties, asking whether anyone had noticed unusual camping setups, abandoned fire pits, or a thin, older man with a tired posture and unsettling mannerisms. Each description was vague on its own. Together, they formed an outline. Meanwhile, the woman's disappearance gained media traction. News stations covered the story nightly. Online forums filled with theories, some wild, some unnervingly accurate. Social media posts circulated warnings about hiking alone. Families began calling in tips about unusual encounters they'd experienced in parks, even if they had brushed them off at the time. One tip came from a couple who'd seen a man pacing near a trail entrance weeks earlier. Another came from a young camper who recalled a van idling late at night, engine running in the dark. A third tip described a man who approached hikers under the guise of asking for directions, but whose presence felt wrong. None of these tips mentioned Hilton by name. But each added a small contour to the fuller picture of who investigators were searching for. At the sheriff's office, a special meeting was called. The incident commander stood at the front of the room, hands pressed against a map, red circles marking reported sightings and possible pattern points. The concern in his voice was unmistakable. "We are not just looking for a missing hiker," he said. "We are looking for a repeat offender." The room went silent. He continued, tapping one of the circles on the map. "This location, this trailhead, isn't random. This person knows these woods. He knows the timing. He knows when people are most vulnerable. This is someone who's comfortable here." An FBI agent stepped forward and added a chilling detail. "He's likely done this before." That statement settled over the room like cold air. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. Rangers leaned in closer. Seasoned officers scribbled notes. The acknowledgement wasn't dramatic, but it changed the energy immediately. The idea that the forest might be hiding a serial predator was no longer rumor, it was being discussed openly. Behind the scenes, investigators dug into older case files from Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida. Many reports lacked conclusive evidence, but similarities were striking. Hikers disappearing alone. Camping gear abandoned. Cars left untouched in parking lots. No signs of robbery. No clear motive. No suspects ever identified. Different states, different investigators, different circumstances, but the pattern echoed through every report like a faint but persistent drumbeat. A predator who moved. A predator who watched. A predator who didn't rush. Back in the forest, the search team refocused on the footprints discovered earlier. Forensic specialists created plaster casts, analyzing the tread pattern and estimating the height and weight of the individual who made them. The prints suggested a man around 160 to 180 pounds, wearing inexpensive, worn-out hiking boots. The gait indicated irregularity, possibly knee issues or an old injury. It wasn't much. But it aligned with several witness descriptions. Investigators also revisited the grainy gas station footage from the morning of her disappearance. Technicians enhanced the video, adjusting the contrast, sharpening outlines, and isolating the background frame where the white van briefly appeared. The details remained blurred, but the silhouette of the vehicle was clearer now: narrow body, high roof, aging paint, a mismatched panel on one side. One detective rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I've seen that style of van before," he said. "Older models. Some folks live out of them." An agent responded, "He might be transient, moving between parks." The detective nodded slowly. "Or hiding in them." They began compiling a list of known transients with similar vehicles across adjacent counties, individuals who had been reported for disturbing behavior, trespassing, or unusual encounters in the wilderness. It was a long list, but Hilton was on it, though not prominently. His name appeared only once, buried in a note about a ranger asking him to move his van from an unauthorized camping spot. But the description matched the growing profile too closely to ignore. A deputy circled Hilton's name and passed it to the lead investigator. At that moment, the first real connection was made. They didn't know how close they were. While investigators worked through leads, the forest remained unchanged, quiet, vast, unbothered. Hilton used that indifference to his advantage, driving deeper into remote areas where cell service vanished and foot traffic was nearly non-existent. He camped near rivers, cooked simple meals, and sharpened his knife by firelight. But for the first time since the second abduction, he felt something besides calm. Pressure. Not fear. Not guilt. Pressure. He followed news coverage on a small radio, listening to statements from the sheriff and pleas from families. He didn't panic at the updates, but he registered each one carefully, adjusting his travel routes based on search locations and public advisories. He believed he could outmaneuver them. After all, he'd spent years slipping through the cracks of society, unseen and unchallenged. But he underestimated something he could not see. The coordination forming between multiple states. Investigators from Georgia called counterparts in Florida. Officers in North Carolina compared notes with detectives in Alabama. The FBI pulled information from the missing persons database and cross-referenced it with Wilder incidents spanning more than a decade. And a picture was forming. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. A man in his 60s. Thin. Transient. Living out of a van. Familiar with national forests. Possibly mentally unstable. Seen multiple times in areas connected to missing hikers. His name hadn't surfaced yet, not fully. But the outline of the predator was becoming undeniable. At dusk, the sheriff stood outside the command center speaking to reporters. His voice was steady, but the gravity behind it was unmistakable. "We have reason to believe the disappearance is connected to criminal activity," he said. "We're asking anyone who's seen an older man traveling alone, possibly with a van, in or near forested areas, to contact us immediately." That statement lit a spark. Tips doubled overnight. Hikers recalled strange encounters in frightening clarity. Campground hosts reported odd behavior from a man who refused to give his last name. And one convenience store clerk recognized the sketch that aired on television, an older man who bought cheap food, lighters, and camping gear weeks earlier. "He gave me a bad feeling," the clerk said. "Like he was there, but not really there." Investigators logged the tip. Another thread added to the web. Meanwhile, miles away, Hilton sat alone near a fire ring, his van parked at an angle that allowed him to see anyone approaching. He ate quietly, methodically, unaware that for the first time, the wall separating him from law enforcement was beginning to weaken. He still believed in his invisibility. He still believed he was ahead. He still believed the forest protected him. But the truth was shifting. The investigation was no longer blind. They were coming for him. Not with guesses, but with clarity. And the days of walking unnoticed through the trees were coming to an end. The investigation reached a turning point just as the search effort seemed ready to stall. Leads were thinning, the forest offered no new clues, and volunteers were exhausted. But behind the scenes, inside conference rooms lit by fluorescent bulbs, in late-night phone calls between jurisdictions, and on cluttered desks stacked with paperwork, threads were finally weaving together. It started with a detective in Florida reviewing old case notes. He had been following the news coverage of the missing hiker and noticed something eerily familiar, the mention of a thin older man camping near trailheads. The detail tugged at a memory from an unsolved case years earlier. A missing hiker, a remote forested area, a suspicious van seen in passing. He pulled the file. Then he made a call. "Are you investigating a guy with a white van?" he asked the lead investigator in Georgia. "Thin, older, looks worn down, maybe early 60s. The answer was yes. The Florida detective replied, "We might have seen the same man." That call sparked a cascade. Soon, investigators from North Carolina contacted the task force. Then officers from Tennessee. Each jurisdiction described a similar man, similar sightings, similar uneasy encounters. None of the interactions had been strong enough to build a case at the time, but now, viewed collectively, they drew a clear outline. This man was moving. This man was watching. This man was circling national forests across multiple states. The idea of a transient predator operating across the southeast was no longer just a theory. It was becoming fact. Rangers at various trail systems were questioned. Some remembered asking an older man to move his van from restricted areas. Others recalled heated arguments over camping rules. One ranger distinctly remembered him taking photographs of hikers, not in a friendly way, but in a way that felt off. What stood out about him, investigators asked. The ranger hesitated. He didn't smile. Not even out of politeness. His face looked empty. Another ranger from North Carolina added. He talked to himself. Whispering under his breath. You couldn't tell if he was angry or just somewhere else. These accounts were unsettling, but valuable. Altogether, they began defining not just an appearance,
but a personality, quiet, detached, unpredictable, and deeply embedded in wilderness environments. Agents placed markers on a large wall map, pinpointing each sighting. The result was alarming. The locations didn't scatter randomly, they formed a slow, meandering trail through national forests, state parks, and remote campgrounds. It was a path that reflected a nomadic existence, someone who lived from state to state, traveling by backroads and sleeping in the shadows of the trees. And every so often, along that path, a hiker disappeared. Still no name. Still no confirmed suspect. But the net was building shape. Back in Georgia, the sheriff's department received another tip, this time from someone who had encountered a strange man months earlier near a campground. He had approached the caller with unsettling confidence, asking odd questions about hiking plans and trail choices. The caller had written down the van's partial license plate, just in case, noting that the man made his skin crawl. That partial plate was gold. Investigators ran it through databases across 3 states. It wasn't enough for an exact match, but it narrowed the list significantly. After excluding local residents, businesses, and inactive registrations, they were left with a handful of possibilities. At the top of that short list, Gary Michael Hilton. White male. 61 years old. Transient. Driving an older white van. When the lead investigator read his name aloud, the room grew still. They ran his history, petty crimes, minor infractions, nothing that screamed homicide. But the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the details became. Hilton had a pattern of threatening behavior, unstable employment, and long stretches of living in the woods. He had been detained once for acting erratically but released without charges. He had no stable address, no close family ties, and no community roots. He fit the profile too well. The FBI immediately added him as a person of interest. Not a suspect yet. But no longer a shadow. They printed his photo and showed it to rangers, hikers, store clerks, campground hosts, and anyone in nearby towns who might have seen him. Many shook their heads. But some paused, eyes narrowing, memories resurfacing. Yes. I think I saw him. He was in here buying supplies. He was asking about trail closures. He gave me a creepy feeling. None of the accounts were perfect, memories were fragmented, faces blurred by time. But taken together, they confirmed investigators were on the right track. Meanwhile, Hilton remained oblivious to how close the walls were closing in. He continued moving through remote areas, relying on routines he believed kept him invisible. He cooked meals on his camp stove, combed his thinning hair in the side mirror of his van, and spoke to himself in low murmurs that drifted into the night. He monitored radio chatter but never assumed the investigation was truly catching up to him. He believed his simplicity protected him. An old van, a quiet demeanor, a life in the woods, these were things society ignored. He knew people expected predators to be charismatic, dramatic, or outwardly violent. Hilton was none of those. He was plain. Forgettable. Unremarkable. That was his shield. And he believed it made him untouchable. But something soon broke that illusion. It began with a store clerk who recognized Hilton's picture on the news. She called the tip line, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "Yes, he was just here. Bought food." Drove off headed toward the forest road. Minutes later, the call reached the sheriff's office. Then the FBI. Then the task force. Officers scrambled, coordinating in real time. Units were dispatched to the area. Rangers blocked entrances. Patrol cars moved quietly down forest roads. Helicopters were placed on standby in case he attempted to flee deeper into the wilderness. For the first time, they weren't searching the forest blindly. They were hunting a man. A specific man. A man with a name, a face, a vehicle. And that man, at that exact moment, was sitting inside his van, unaware that dozens of law enforcement personnel were converging on the area around him. He sharpened his knife with slow, even strokes. The same rhythm investigators would later describe as chillingly calm. As the net around him tightened with every passing minute. For years, Hilton had moved through forests believing the trees hid him. But now, for the first time, the forest itself had betrayed him. Not with a shout, not with a clue. But with a single witness who remembered his face. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Chapter 11, A Predator Exposed, The Manhunt Begins. The call that placed Gary Michael Hilton at the center of the investigation didn't explode like a dramatic reveal, it arrived quietly, almost casually, from a clerk who simply trusted her instincts. But sometimes quiet things carry the greatest weight. Within minutes of her phone call, the atmosphere inside the command center shifted. Maps were unrolled, radios activated, and officers gathered around monitors displaying the surrounding forest routes. For the first time, investigators had something concrete. A direction. The clerk recalled Hilton heading north along a back road that eventually split into multiple forest access points. It wasn't a heavily trafficked route. In fact, it was known primarily to locals. Hunters, and backpackers. That wasn't coincidence. Hilton gravitated toward places where few eyes watched and where silence swallowed everything that happened beneath the trees. Deputies were dispatched immediately. Marked patrol vehicles moved in pairs down opposite ends of the road, scanning the shoulders for any sign of the white van. Unmarked cars followed at slower speeds, watching for fresh tire tracks or signs of a recent turnoff. Helicopter units were placed on standby in case the van was discovered parked deep in the woods. Hilton had no idea that the search had shifted from broad sweeps to a targeted pursuit. Inside his van, he ate quietly, crackers and a small can of chicken, mindlessly consumed as he stared at the forest ahead. His mind was elsewhere, drifting through familiar loops of thought, resentment, superiority, and the belief that he had outmaneuvered the world simply by existing on its fringes. He felt his usual sense of stillness. He felt safe. He didn't realize how much the landscape around him had changed. Law enforcement vehicles were now only miles away. The forest road he had driven for years without interruption was becoming a funnel. The space he relied on for isolation was shrinking. And with each passing minute, the net tightened. What investigators didn't know, but would later learn, was that Hilton was beginning to unravel. The calm confidence that had carried him through his earlier crimes was starting to fray. His supplies were dwindling. His van was running poorly. He had slept poorly the previous nights, waking at small noises in the woods, convinced someone was watching him. Even predators can feel hunted. And Hilton, for the first time in years, felt a flicker of vulnerability. He brushed it aside. He told himself the fear was irrational. He convinced himself the investigation was far behind him. But the cracks were forming. Detectives, meanwhile, were working through a structured plan. They divided the search area into sectors, assigning teams to approach from multiple directions. Experienced trackers moved slowly along the tree line, examining fresh impressions in the dirt, tire treads, boot marks, and subtle disturbances left by vehicles that had recently pulled off the road. One deputy radioed in, "Found tracks. Recent. Could be him." Supervisors marked the spot on the map. The investigation accelerated again. At the same time, the behavioral analysis team reviewed Hilton's profile in detail, explaining to local deputies what they should expect once contact was made. "He's unpredictable," an analyst said. "He presents calm but is easily agitated. If cornered, he may attempt to talk his way out. He may also become aggressive. Proceed with caution." Those words carried a weight that settled heavily in the room. The manhunt wasn't for a clever mastermind or a charismatic manipulator. It was for someone volatile, someone who had lived years on the edge of society, shaping his identity around delusions and wilderness isolation. Someone who believed he understood the forest better than anyone else. That arrogance made him dangerous. Hilton finished his meal and walked outside his van. The forest was still. No wind, no hikers, no nearby campsites, just the dense canopy and the dirt road stretching into shadow. Birds fluttered briefly overhead. He listened closely. Something felt different, though he couldn't identify it. The air seemed thicker. The silence seemed heavier. He dismissed the feeling. Instead, he reached into the van and pulled out his old knife, the one he sharpened each night. He examined the blade closely, then dragged it across the stone with slow, practiced movements. The metallic sound echoed softly among the trees. That sound, investigators would later note, represented more than maintenance. It represented preparation. The kind of preparation that made their race against time even more urgent. A few miles away, a deputy spotted a distinct tire impression leading off the road toward a clearing obscured by pines. He approached slowly, scanning for movement. The impression was fresh, and the debris disturbed by the tires hadn't yet settled. He radioed in. "I think this is him." Within minutes, officers converged on the location. They approached quietly, following the tracks deeper into the trees. Birds scattered. Branches snapped under careful boots. The forest, once indifferent, now seemed to lean inward, holding its breath. But the clearing was empty. The tire tracks formed a tight arc. Hilton had driven in, stayed briefly, then left quickly. Investigators noted the churn patterns in the dirt. He had left in a hurry, turning sharply as he sped out. It was the first sign that he sensed danger. Something had spooked him. Now the pursuit became urgent. Officers moved quickly back to the main road. Patrol vehicles spread out again. The helicopter lifted off, slicing across the treetops with steady determination. Inside his van, Hilton was talking to himself, low, sharp mutters that revealed his unraveling psyche. People, watching. Forest changing. Gotta move. Gotta keep going. These were not the words of someone confident. These were the words of a man cornered by forces he couldn't see. But he still believed he could escape through the forest's vastness. Through backroads, through trailheads, through the wilderness he thought belonged to him. What he didn't know, what would soon shatter his delusion, was that the world he relied on for concealment was becoming the very thing exposing him. Investigators now had a name, a van, a direction, and a pattern that pointed toward imminent danger. And the next time they caught his trail, they wouldn't lose it. The manhunt was no longer theoretical. It was active, urgent, closing in by the hour. Hilton kept driving. But now, for the first time, people were following. Hilton drove deeper into the forest road, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as the trees blurred past his windows. He felt the unease growing, an invisible pressure that crept up the back of his neck. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was instinct, the primal feeling that he was no longer the only one moving through the woods. For years he had believed the forest protected him. He walked its trails with silent confidence, slept under its canopy without fear, and made it the stage for his darkest impulses. But now, something had shifted. The woods felt smaller. The shadows felt closer. Inside his van, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old fabric, camping gear, and the remnants of meals eaten on the run. Hilton muttered to himself, tapping his fingers on the dashboard, glancing repeatedly in the mirrors. His thoughts tangled and spiraled, his mind oscillating between paranoia and self-assurance. "They're guessing, just guessing," he whispered. "They don't know. They can't know." But the certainty he once relied on had begun to fracture. As he reached a bend in the road, he slowed the van and turned sharply into a narrow dirt path partially concealed by pines. He had used this route before. It ran parallel to a hiking trail but was hidden well enough that only locals knew of it. The tires crunched over fallen twigs and dry leaves, leaving fresh impressions investigators would later find. He parked the van and stepped out, scanning the surroundings with quick, nervous movements. The forest was quiet. No footsteps. No voices. No engines. Just the soft, distant rustle of wind moving through branches. Under any other circumstances, this silence would have comforted him. Now, it only made his pulse quicken. Hilton walked in circles around the clearing, talking softly to himself. Not here. Not this time. They won't catch me. They think they're close, but they're not. But he felt the truth pressing against him. The investigation wasn't drifting anymore, it was converging. Miles away, officers were working quickly, guided not by luck but by structure. Patrol cars were positioned strategically at connecting forest roads. Rangers were stationed at trail entrances. Deputies combed through campgrounds. The helicopter circling overhead wasn't searching blindly, it was following a pattern designed by analysts who understood how a transient predator might move. Every minute, the distance between Hilton and law enforcement shrank. Still unaware of how close danger truly was, Hilton paced the clearing, rehearsing possible routes. He considered driving farther north. He considered abandoning his van and entering the forest on foot. He considered heading to another state entirely, returning to the lonely highways he once used to disappear for months at a time. But he couldn't decide. His mind, once frighteningly methodical, now stuttered under the weight of pressure. He ran his hands through his thinning hair, muttering sharply, his tone shifting from irritation to panic. Too many people, too many roads blocked, they're everywhere. The forest no longer felt like home, it felt like a labyrinth tightening around him. And then he heard something. A faint rumble in the distance. Low, steady, unmistakable. An engine. Hilton froze. His breath hitched. He crouched beside his van, staring through branches, waiting for the sound to grow louder. It did. Slowly at first, then more clearly. Gravel shifting under tires. A vehicle approaching along the outer road. He ducked lower, movements tense and jerky. A sheriff's SUV appeared through a gap in the trees, moving deliberately, not fast but with purpose. The deputy inside scanned the roadside as he drove, looking for disturbances or signs of a vehicle pulling off. Hilton held his breath as the SUV crept past his hidden turnoff. The deputy didn't see the clearing. He didn't see the van. But Hilton didn't feel relief. He felt exposed. The SUV continued down the road, its brake lights flickering briefly before disappearing around a bend. Hilton remained crouched long after the vehicle was gone, his thoughts racing. He wasn't used to prey instincts, he had always walked the world as a predator. But now, for the first time, he felt hunted. Inside the command center, the deputy radioed in. No van on this stretch. Continuing further north. He had missed Hilton by less than 50 yards. But close calls were piling up, and investigators were narrowing the radius of the search with every pass. As the afternoon sun lowered, painting long shadows across the forest, Hilton made a decision. He couldn't stay in one place. He couldn't rely on the van forever. He needed supplies, fresh water, and distance. Above all, he needed to believe he still had control. He climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered. He tried again. It sputtered again. His face twisted in frustration. The van had been reliable for years despite its age, but constant travel, rough terrain, and neglect were catching up with it. He hit the dashboard, muttering curses under his breath. Eventually, the engine caught. The van shuddered to life. Hilton exhaled with relief, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and pulled out of the clearing, merging once again with the forest road. He drove slowly at first, listening for unusual sounds from the engine, then sped up as he gained confidence. But he didn't realize that the same deputy who passed earlier had returned to double-check a suspicious patch of disturbed soil near the turnoff. The deputy called for backup. 2 more cars joined him. Together, they examined the dirt, the broken branches, the flattened brush. One of them knelt down, tracing the tire tracks with his fingertip. "These are fresh," he said. "Real fresh." They followed the tracks deeper, emerging into the clearing Hilton had just left minutes earlier. The grass was still, flattened where the van had sat. The scent of smoke lingered faintly, likely from Hilton's small camp stove. Footprints were visible around the site, erratic, overlapping, as though the person had been pacing. The lead deputy felt the hairs on his arms rise. He was just here. They radioed in immediately. The forest erupted into coordinated movement. Patrol cars redirected. Rangers spread out. The helicopter intensified its sweep. The task force commander issued a simple, chilling order. "He's close. Don't let him slip away." Hilton drove north, unaware of how narrowly he had been missed. But the tension pressing on him continued to grow. Sweat rolled down the back of his neck. His fingers twitched on the steering wheel. His foot hovered uncertainly between the pedals. The forest on either side of the road no longer felt endless, it felt like it was closing in. He slowed at an intersection where two dirt roads met, trying to decide which direction offered the best escape. A gust of wind rustled the branches overhead, startling him. He jerked the wheel slightly, heart pounding. The predator who once walked trails with the quiet confidence of someone invisible was becoming frantic. Behind him, investigators were closing gaps with surgical precision. They shared updated coordinates. They adjusted roadblocks. They questioned drivers leaving the forest. They checked campgrounds and trailheads. A pattern began forming, not of where Hilton was, but where he was headed. He wasn't fleeing randomly. He was following familiar terrain. Roads he had driven for years. Routes etched into his mind. One investigator traced the projected path on the map. "He's taking the Northern Ridge route," she said. "It's the only way that makes sense." The commander nodded slowly. "Then that's where we set the trap." Miles away, Hilton turned onto that very road. The sun dipped lower, pulling the forest into a heavy twilight. The world around him darkened. And for the first time, he could feel the hunt catching up to him. Chapter 12, Closing the Distance, The Break in the Case. Night fell over the forest like a curtain, thick and heavy. The temperature dropped, and a cool mist crept across the road as Hilton drove north, gripping the steering wheel with a tension that hadn't been there weeks before. His eyes darted between the rearview mirror and the dark stretch of road ahead, searching for headlights, silhouettes, anything that signaled danger. But the road remained empty. Silent. Black. The kind of silence that once comforted him, once felt like protection, now pressed on his chest like a weight. The forest wasn't his sanctuary tonight. It felt like a long corridor with no exit. He reached up and turned off his headlights for a moment, letting the van roll in darkness. It was a behavior he had practiced many times, a tactic meant to prevent anyone from spotting his location. But tonight, the gesture felt desperate. He flicked the lights back on and muttered something sharp under his breath. "Can't trust the dark, can't trust anything." His voice shook slightly. His mind, normally methodical in its paranoia, now drowned under a tide of scattered thoughts. Meanwhile, several miles behind him, investigators were tightening their formation. The discovery of Hilton's clearing had transformed the manhunt into a pursuit. A deputy marked the location of the clearing on a map, drawing a red line along the only road Hilton could have used to head north. "It's a bottleneck," he said. "He has to take this road. There's no other exit." The FBI agent beside him nodded. "Then we cut him off before he reaches the ridge." Patrol cars repositioned immediately. 2 units moved to block the northern entrance. Another set drove south, hoping to catch Hilton if he doubled back. The helicopter circled wider, its searchlight still off to avoid alerting him, but its thermal camera sweeping the tree lines. Though the forest was vast, the road system was small, just two narrow dirt routes leading deeper into the wilderness. Hilton believed he had endless pathways. But from an aerial view, he was confined to a thin, winding artery running through a maze of trees. He wasn't free. He was funneled. And investigators were waiting. Hilton didn't know any of this. He only felt the pressure building, that creeping sensation that someone was following him, even if he couldn't see them yet. His breathing became shallow. His hands trembled slightly. The van rattled over potholes, each jolt adding to his rising agitation. Too many people, too many eyes, gotta move. His muttering grew faster. He didn't realize that the same muttering was now one of the biggest clues for officers. Witnesses had described it. Rangers remembered it. Store clerks pointed it out. A man who talked to himself in short, frustrated bursts. That detail, more than anything else, made Hilton stand out, made him recognizable. And now, with more people looking for him, descriptions from strangers were finally aligning into a single picture. Farther north, officers set up a checkpoint, not a visible one, but a silent barricade. Cars were parked out of sight. Deputies stood behind trees, radios muted. They waited in complete stillness, listening for the distant growl of an approaching engine. Every minute stretched into 2. Every sound drew their attention. Finally, one deputy whispered into his radio. "Engine noise. South End. Getting closer." The entire group tensed. If it was Hilton, he was driving straight into their trap. If it wasn't, they would know soon enough. The commander responded quietly. "Do not engage until we confirm the vehicle." They waited, eyes fixed on the bend of the road where a faint glow of headlights began to flicker between the trees. Hilton saw nothing unusual as he approached the ridge, the same familiar stretch of road he traveled dozens of times. He felt confident now, believing he had outrun the vague threat behind him. He even spoke aloud in a calmer tone. "They don't know this road, nobody knows this road like I do." He believed the forest was on his side. He believed he had slipped through the cracks of society again. But just as he reached the crest of the ridge, his headlights illuminated something unexpected. A small branch lying across the road. Not large enough to block traffic. Not natural-looking enough to be accidental. Hilton's foot hovered over the brake. He slowed the van. His instincts prickled. He leaned forward, inspecting the branch, noticing it didn't match the surrounding trees. Someone had placed it there, purposefully. He felt his stomach twist. He didn't know that the branch was a marker. A silent indicator used by officers to coordinate positioning on the narrow ridge road. He didn't know that deputies were just beyond the bend, waiting. He didn't know that the forest around him wasn't empty. It was lined with law enforcement frozen in quiet anticipation. He only knew something was wrong. He put the van in park, listening. He heard nothing. No engines. No voices. Only wind. But the stillness of the forest didn't feel natural. It felt staged. He whispered, "They're close, too close." Panic began to claw its way up his throat. He shifted the van into reverse, intending to back down the ridge, but his tires spun against the soft dirt. He cursed under his breath, shifting again, pressing harder. The van lurched but barely moved. The incline was working against him. In the distance, a deputy whispered into his radio. "Tires. I hear tires." The search team leaned forward. The commander raised his hand sharply and whispered. "Stand by." Hilton's breathing turned jagged. His hands slipped on the steering wheel from sweat. He looked around wildly, feeling trapped. The forest, once his fortress, now felt like walls closing in around him. He tried driving forward. The van jerked. The wheels caught on something, roots, rocks. Rocks, he couldn't tell. Frustration flared. He opened the driver's door, stepping out into the cool night air. His boots crunched loudly on the gravel. He froze, staring into the trees, listening for anything. And for the first time, he thought he heard movement. A soft rustle. A shuffle. Something faint but deliberate. "Who's there?" he snapped, voice cracking. Silence. He swallowed hard. He wasn't imagining things. The forest had changed. It had become alert, watchful. He felt dozens of unseen eyes staring back at him. The delusion that had sustained him for years, that he controlled the woods, finally cracked. He knew someone was near. He just didn't know how many. He scrambled back into the van, slamming the door shut. His hands shook violently as he fumbled for the keys, trying to restart the engine. From the ridge ahead, a deputy murmured into his radio. "He's here. He's panicking." The commander whispered. "Hold positions. Do not move until I give the order." They had him. Not physically. Not completely. But psychologically. For the first time, Gary Hilton felt cornered. And investigators were only moments away from turning that fear into capture. Chapter 12, Closing the Distance, the break in the case. The engine finally sputtered back to life, coughing like an old animal forced awake. Hilton gripped the wheel with white knuckles, his breath shallow, his mind spinning through escape routes that no longer existed. The forest felt hostile, every tree a potential hiding place for someone watching him. Every shadow a threat. He pressed the accelerator. The van lurched forward. The road remained dark and narrow, framed by tall pines leaning inward like silent judges. Behind him, in the darkness of the tree line, the deputies listened. They heard the rumble of the van moving again. They noted how uneven the engine sounded, like it wasn't far from giving out for good. The commander whispered, "Let him move. He's trapped either way." The team remained motionless. They knew the terrain. They knew the ridge narrowed further ahead. Hilton didn't. As he continued up the incline, the van groaned under the strain. Hilton leaned forward, his face lit by the dim dashboard glow, eyes twitching toward the mirrors with every passing second. Then he saw it. Far ahead, barely visible. The glint of metal. He slowed instantly. A truck. Parked diagonally across the road. His heart slammed into his ribs. No, no, no. It wasn't a civilian vehicle. The silhouette was wrong. Too squared. Too solid. Too deliberate. It was law enforcement. He hit the brakes. The van skidded. The tires dug into gravel, sending dust into the air. He stared ahead, motionless. The truck didn't move. Its lights were off. It waited in the dark like an animal crouched in the brush. Hilton whispered sharply, "They found me, they found me." His mind raced in circles. He looked for signs, flickers of movement, shifting shadows, anything that revealed how many were out there. He saw nothing. But he felt everything. Behind him, at the other end of the ridge, officers began moving quietly into position. Not rushing, closing in slowly, carefully, like tightening a snare. 2 deputies flanked the road with rifles held low, ready but steady. Another crept closer to the tree line, eyes fixed on Hilton's rear bumper. The commander stayed back, radio in hand, controlling the flow with calm precision. The forest was alive with tension. Breath held. Boots quiet. Branches barely swaying. And in the center of it all sat Gary Michael Hilton, stuck on a ridge no wider than a 2-lane road, his only exit blocked ahead and behind. He put the van in reverse. But as soon as he started backing up, the engine sputtered again. A horrible timing. A mechanical betrayal. The van jerked, coughed, and stalled. Hilton slammed his fists on the wheel. "Come on. Come on. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again, voice cracking into panic. Still nothing. His breathing spiraled, fast, shallow, frantic. The edges of his vision blurred. The forest pressed in closer, suffocating him with the realization that for the first time in decades, he had truly run out of space. He opened the driver's door, ready to flee into the woods on foot. But he froze. Because he heard them. Not footsteps. Not voices. Something more subtle. Radios clicking, soft, controlled. A twig snapping under a boot. A breath exhaled from behind a tree. They were everywhere. Hilton stumbled backward, eyes wide, turning in circles like a cornered animal. I didn't do anything, he shouted toward the darkness, desperate, unconvincing. I didn't do anything. His voice echoed off the trees, brittle and cracking. A deep voice responded from somewhere ahead. Gary, step away from the van. Hilton's body stiffened. The voice wasn't yelling. It wasn't harsh. It was calm, so calm it unnerved him. Another voice came from behind him. It's over, Gary. Don't make this harder. Hilton turned sharply, eyes darting between shadows. He saw a silhouette now, just barely. Then another. And another. They emerged slowly from the darkness, a coordinated movement, as though the forest itself had come alive to pull him out of hiding. A flashlight beam flickered on, pointed at his feet, not his face. A technique meant to avoid escalation. Hilton lifted his hands halfway. His breaths came in broken gasps. You can't be doing this, he stammered, voice high and uneven. I didn't hurt anybody. I didn't. But his rambling only solidified what officers already knew. They had the right man. The commander stepped forward at last, visible enough for Hilton to recognize authority but distant enough to maintain control. Gary Michael Hilton, he said firmly. You're under arrest. Hilton blinked rapidly, his brain scrambling for a loophole, one last path of escape. There was none. Just darkness. Just the echo of boots on dirt as they closed in around him. One deputy approached with cuffs, moving steadily, voice low. Hilton flinched. Don't touch me. Hands behind your back, Gary. Hilton hesitated. But the forest's silence swallowed him whole, and with a trembling exhale, he turned around. Cold steel clicked around his wrists. The moment the cuffs locked, something shifted inside him. His shoulders sagged. His voice died in his throat. His eyes dropped to the ground. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply deflated. The predator who stalked forests for years had finally been caught. Not with violence. Not with chaos. But with quiet inevitability. Officers guided him toward the roadblock truck. The helicopter overhead finally flicked on its searchlight. A white beam that cut through the darkness like judgment. Hilton stumbled once on the gravel, and a deputy steadied him. The commander watched silently. After years of fear, years of unanswered disappearances, years of forest trails filled with dread. The hunt was over. And Gary Michael Hilton, the man who believed the woods would always protect him, walked out of the forest in handcuffs. Chapter 13, The Interrogation, Cracks in the Mask. The interrogation room was small, quiet, and unnervingly bright, its white walls reflecting every flicker of movement as Gary Michael Hilton sat hunched in the metal chair, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly on the table in front of him while two detectives observed him from across the room with a silence that made the air feel heavier than the steel cuffs around his wrists. They didn't speak, not yet, letting him sit in the stillness long enough for the weight of his situation to settle in. And as the minutes dragged on, Hilton's eyes drifted restlessly, from the door, to the tabletop, to the mirrored wall he didn't realize concealed a small team of investigators watching his every breath, his mind spinning with the frantic disorientation of a man who had run out of places to hide. When the detectives finally spoke, their tone was low, calm, almost gentle, the kind of tone reserved not for threats but for unraveling, and they begun not with accusations but with questions about his day, where he had been heading, whether the van breaking down had scared him. Hilton's responses were stiff at first, evasive, a shaky attempt to regain the sense of control that had governed his life for years in the forests. But each answer exposed more of his anxiety, his voice cracked subtly, his words circled one another without direction, and his eyes avoided the detectives in a way that told them everything they needed to know. He was afraid. They leaned in slightly, shifting the conversation just enough to probe deeper, not with aggressive tactics but with subtle pressure, the kind that forces a man to confront the reality he spent years outrunning, and Hilton's facade weakened with every minute that passed, his breathing growing uneven, his fingers tapping on the metal table in a rhythm that betrayed the agitation simmering beneath his outward silence. The detectives mentioned the clearing where he had camped, the branch placed across the road, the witness descriptions that matched him down to the muttering habit he never realized he'd become known for, and with each detail, Hilton's composure faltered just a little more, like a structure beginning to crack under its own weight. He shifted in his chair, shoulders tightening, his gaze flicking to the door as if calculating an escape route he knew didn't exist, and when the detectives finally referenced the victims, softly, carefully, without accusation, Hilton's entire body stilled as though someone had pressed pause on him. His jaw flexed. His throat bobbed. His fingers stopped tapping. It was the smallest shift, subtle enough that only trained investigators would recognize it, but it was unmistakable. He wasn't confused by the reference, only triggered by it. One detective leaned forward gently, sliding a photo onto the table, not graphic, simply a portrait of a missing person, and Hilton's reaction was immediate and telling. He recoiled, eyes narrowing, breath stalling in the back of his throat, and he tried to mask the reaction by turning his head, by claiming he didn't know her, but the detectives exchanged a quiet glance, knowing they had found the first crack. They changed tactics slowly, weaving personal questions with pointed ones, circling him psychologically the way he had once circled victims in the forest, and though Hilton attempted to hold to his fragmenting narrative, claiming coincidence, claiming he had only been camping, claiming he was misunderstood, the detectives could see the tremors of uncertainty building in him, the way his shifting stories contradicted one another, the way his voice wavered when pressed on specific timelines. Hours passed like this, the room growing smaller with each rotation of questioning, and Hilton began unraveling in real time. His shoulders slumped, his tone fluctuated between defiance and resignation, and he kept wiping his palms on his jeans as though scrubbing away the anxiety pooling beneath his skin. When the detectives brought up physical evidence, footprints, tire tracks, items found near the clearing, Hilton's breath hitched sharply, and a faint tremor crossed his expression. He tried one more time to regain control by insisting they were framing him, insisting he was being hunted for no reason, but his argument collapsed under its own desperation, and the detectives didn't need to counter it. They simply let the silence do the work. Silence can be louder than confession, and Hilton felt its weight pressing down on him, squeezing his chest, sharpening the edges of his panic until he finally exhaled in a long, broken breath that revealed everything the detectives had been waiting for. He was tired. Tired of running. Tired of hiding. Tired of the paranoia that had wormed into every corner of his mind. And in that exhaustion, the final crack formed. He glanced toward the mirrored wall again, sensing the presence of unseen observers. He twitched, licked his lips, and then murmured in a voice barely above a whisper, "You don't know the whole story." It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was the doorway to one, the kind of statement that invites follow-up, that signals psychological surrender. The detectives didn't rush him, they encouraged him to talk, to explain, to fill the silence, and slowly, painfully, Hilton began to speak, not directly about the crimes, but about his life, his loneliness, his resentment, his belief that society had pushed him to the margins, and while his words were fragmented, contradictory, and self-serving, they nonetheless revealed motive, intention, and a breakdown of his mental state over years of isolation. He talked about the forests as though they were living companions, about fear of being seen, about anger at being forgotten, and each sentence edged closer to the truth he was trying desperately to avoid saying. When the detectives placed more photos on the table, Hilton's eyes lingered too long on certain ones, long enough to show recognition, long enough to betray guilt, and though he didn't openly admit to the acts behind those missing persons, his silence became its own admission. The detectives softened their tone again, encouraging him to continue, and gradually, Hilton's muttering returned, not the angry muttering of the forest, but a fragile, almost disoriented rambling that revealed how deeply unmoored he had become. He spoke in circles about destiny, about survival, about choices, about consequences, and as he drifted deeper into the labyrinth of his own fractured logic, the detectives guided him back with gentle redirection until his fragmented narrative began aligning into something coherent enough to hold meaning. By the end of the session, Hilton was slumped over, drained, his voice barely audible as he whispered disjointed reflections about being chased, cornered. Chapter 14, The Evidence Speaks, Unmasking the Trail of a Predator. The hours following Hilton's interrogation unfolded like the slow tightening of a net, methodical, inevitable, and grounded not in confession but in the quiet certainty of evidence, because while Hilton retreated back into the holding cell with the exhausted posture of a man whose denial was cracking, investigators across multiple counties were moving with renewed purpose, stitching together the fragments of a puzzle that had been scattered across state lines, forests, and years of unanswered disappearances. In the task force room, the atmosphere shifted from tension to focus. Maps were spread across tables, photographs arranged in chronological order, pins connected with twine marking trails, campsites, abandoned vehicles, and last known locations. Forensic analysts filed in with early reports, soil samples, fiber traces, impressions from the van's tires, and each detail, no matter how small, began aligning with patterns that pointed unmistakably toward Hilton's movements. The van itself, now impounded under heavy guard, became a silent archive of his habits. Inside, officers found the usual clutter of a transient life, cooking pots, worn blankets, old fuel cans, but beneath that surface lay subtle evidence that told a deeper story, traces of mud matching multiple forest regions, scraps of duct tape with faint impressions, fibers consistent with clothing worn by missing victims, and handwritten notes that revealed the obsessive, erratic planning Hilton had relied on for years. None of these details were damning alone, but together they formed a mosaic of behavior, predictable routes he traveled, sites he revisited, patterns of isolation he preferred, and investigators cross-referenced each finding with disappearance dates until the timeline grew tighter, the coincidences fewer, and the connections clearer. Meanwhile, detectives contacted law enforcement in neighboring states, sharing the arrest details and requesting case files on long-cold missing persons reports, and the responses came swiftly. Georgia sent records of a vanished hiker whose final cell signal was last traced near a trail Hilton was known to frequent. Florida forwarded information about an outdoors woman who had disappeared under circumstances matching Hilton's pattern. North Carolina, Tennessee, and South Carolina provided additional cases, each incomplete, each fragmented, but all echoing familiar details that made investigators' pulses quicken. The task force spread these case files on the table, comparing dates, distances, witness sightings, and environmental details, and the more they studied the documents, the more the narrative emerged, not the chaotic, impulsive chaos Hilton had implied, but a chilling consistency in the way he targeted, stalked, and isolated victims in the quietest corners of the wilderness. As the evidence piled up, the forensic lab provided its next breakthrough. Boot prints found near one victim's abandoned car matched the tread pattern of Hilton's hiking boots almost perfectly, a model sold only for a few short years, and the wear pattern on the sole matched the gait analysis from surveillance footage at a gas station where Hilton had been recorded just days before one disappearance. Another report confirmed that plant material found wedged in the van's front bumper came from the same region where search teams discovered a cluster of disturbed soil several months earlier. The correlation was enough to send deputies back to that site with cadaver dogs, and within hours, the dogs' behavior changed, alerting near a slope where erosion had partially exposed something unnatural beneath the dirt. Investigators worked carefully, documenting everything, and though they moved without describing anything graphic, the emotional impact in the command center was enough to harden resolve. The forest had begun giving up its secrets, and Hilton's veneer of denial grew weaker with each update. Back at the station, detectives returned to Hilton, not to confront him aggressively but to nudge him with details they knew would weigh on him, they mentioned the boots, the fibers, the soil samples, each detail offered calmly, without accusation, and Hilton's reactions, small twitches of the jaw, rapid blinking, the way his shoulders pulled closer to his neck, betrayed that he understood the inevitability unfolding around him. He tried occasionally to retreat into rambling explanations, weaving half-formed excuses about coincidence and harassment, but his narratives were collapsing, inconsistent and untethered, no longer serving as shields but as windows into his unraveling. When detectives mentioned one victim's name, Hilton stiffened. When they referenced another's disappearance date, his breath stuttered, and by the time they laid out a map showing all the locations linked to him, he couldn't bring himself to look at it. In the observation room behind the mirrored glass, analysts and officers watched his collapse in real time, noting how his once sharp instincts had dissolved into an exhausted resignation. The predator who once navigated forests like a phantom now seemed small, diminished, and overwhelmed by the magnitude of everything closing in around him. The final breakthrough came from a piece of digital evidence. Hilton had visited a local store weeks earlier, and though the security footage was grainy, analysts enhanced it enough to reveal a distinctive detail: the same frayed strap on a pack found in his van, a strap detectives already suspected had belonged to a missing hiker. The timestamp placed Hilton in the region at the same time the victim vanished, and the clerk, when shown the image, recalled Hilton's nervous muttering and erratic behavior. This detail, combined with credit card data showing fuel purchases along the same route, created a trail so clear investigators knew they were ready to move forward with charges. They assembled all of the evidence, physical, digital, circumstantial, environmental, into a coherent narrative that left no room for doubt, and by the time they returned to Hilton for one final interview, the psychological balance had shifted completely. He was no longer the man who walked the forests with quiet confidence but someone cornered by truth, surrounded by facts he couldn't outrun. As detectives laid out the findings in slow, calm detail, Hilton didn't lash out or argue. He simply stared at the table, his eyes distant, his expression hollow, as though finally confronting the reality he had avoided for years. The room was silent except for the detective's voice, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and Hilton's uneven breaths, each one sounding more like resignation than resistance, and when the detective concluded with the quiet statement that they knew everything, Hilton didn't deny it. He didn't speak at all. He simply exhaled, long and shaky, and lowered his head into his hands, an unspoken acknowledgement that the trails he once disappeared into, the forests he once believed he owned, could no longer shield him from the truth. And as investigators stepped out of the room, leaving Hilton alone in the bright, silent space, they knew the case had shifted irrevocably. The evidence had spoken, louder and clearer than any confession ever could, and the man who once thrived in the shadows had finally been dragged fully into the light. Chapter 15, The Final Reckoning, Justice and the Echoes Left Behind. The courtroom where Gary Michael Hilton would face judgment felt strangely ordinary. Rows of polished wooden benches, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the faint shuffle of paperwork and whispered conversations, but beneath that everyday exterior lay a tension so heavy it seemed to pull the air tighter with each passing second, because everyone present understood that this was not merely a legal proceeding but the culmination of years of unanswered questions, nights of fear, and the grief of families who had waited far too long for clarity. When Hilton entered, escorted by deputies, shackles clinking softly with each step, he appeared smaller than the figure who once roamed national forests like a phantom. His posture was hunched, his shoulders drawn inward as though the weight of everything, evidence, exposure, inevitability, had finally bent him into something fragile. He didn't scan the room for familiar faces or adversaries. He kept his eyes low, fixed on the floor, barely acknowledging the world that had spent months piecing together the destruction he left behind. The prosecution began with calm precision, presenting the evidence investigators had spent weeks compiling: maps tracing Hilton's movements from state to state, surveillance images capturing his presence in stores and gas stations near disappearance sites, forensic reports detailing soil samples, boot impressions, fiber matches, vehicle tracks, and items found in his van. Each piece was presented quietly, respectfully, without theatrics, because the facts alone carried a gravity no embellishment could match, and as they stacked one on top of another, the narrative became unmistakable. Hilton's crimes were not accidents, not missteps, not the actions of a man confused or misguided, but deliberate patterns carved into the wilderness over years of calculated movement. Defense attorneys attempted to soften the edges, arguing mental instability, transient lifestyle, erratic behavior, and a lifetime of isolation, but even those attempts landed softly, as though no one truly believed them, not even Hilton himself. He merely sat there, motionless, listening to the story of his life told through evidence instead of memory. Families of victims filled the seats behind the prosecution, parents, siblings, friends, some holding tissues, others sitting stiffly with hands clasped, their grief quiet but palpable, the kind that has lived inside them for so long it has become part of their posture, their breathing, their very identity. When the time came for victim impact statements, the room shifted, the lawyers stepped back, and raw humanity took the floor. One mother approached the stand with trembling hands, her voice steady but laced with decades of pain as she described the last time she saw her daughter, the fear that consumed her every morning after the disappearance, the endless nights searching for answers in a world that had none to give. Another family member spoke not with anger but with heartbreaking softness, describing birthdays missed, empty chairs at holiday tables, and the way the loss had crawled into their lives and stayed there, reshaping everything. Hilton didn't look at them, not out of defiance, but because the weight of their voices seemed too much for him to meet. He stared at the table instead, blinking rapidly, occasionally jaw-clenching in the only outward sign of internal tension. The prosecutor concluded with a final statement, not dramatic, not emotional, simply stating that justice was not revenge but accountability, a recognition of truth, a closing of wounds long left open. When the judge prepared to speak, the courtroom fell into an almost reverent silence, the kind that feels shared even among strangers. He reviewed the charges, the evidence, the statements, and the legal requirements, and then, in a calm, steady voice, delivered the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They settled into the room like an exhale after years of held breath. Hilton didn't flinch, didn't protest, didn't raise his head, he simply absorbed the sentence with the same hollow resignation that had shadowed him since the interrogation, a quiet acknowledgement that the roads and forests that once provided him anonymity had been replaced by walls, routines, and the unending stillness of confinement. As deputies escorted him away, one of the mothers whispered a soft, trembling, "Thank you," to the judge, to the detectives, to anyone who had been part of bringing truth to light, and the room slowly emptied with a mix of relief, exhaustion, and lingering sorrow. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, cameras ready, their questions forming headlines that would shape public memory of the case, but the real legacy of Gary Michael Hilton existed not in sensationalism but in the ripples he left across communities, families, and the outdoor world itself. Hikers who once approached forest trails with carefree joy now carried a new awareness, a quiet vigilance that reminded them the wilderness, as beautiful as it is, can also shelter those who wish to disappear. Search and rescue teams pushed for better communication systems, improved tracking protocols, and increased cooperation between states to prevent predators from exploiting the gaps in jurisdiction. And forensic technology, especially the analysis of soil, fibers, and environmental evidence, gained new attention, reshaping how future cases would be approached. In prison, Hilton faded into the monotony of daily routine, no longer the wanderer who slipped between tree lines but an inmate bound by structure and silence. He spent most days isolated, muttering to himself, occasionally repeating grievances from his trial that no longer had power, and though he never offered a full, direct confession that satisfied every lingering question, the evidence that filled the courtroom spoke for him more clearly than he ever could. For the families, closure wasn't absolute, closure rarely is, but the knowledge that Hilton would never walk free again offered a measure of peace, a stillness they could finally begin to fold into their lives. And for investigators, the end of the Hilton case marked not a victory but a reminder of why they do what they do, to bring light to the darkest corners, to give answers where there were none, to speak for those who can't. In the years that followed, the forests where Hilton once roamed continued to stand tall and quiet, unchanged on the surface but forever marked by the history that unfolded beneath their branches. Hikers passed through trails that once carried his footsteps, unaware of the full weight of the stories held in the soil beneath them, and in a way, that was its own form of healing, the world moving forward while memory remained, preserved, acknowledged. but no longer feared. And so the story of Gary Michael Hilton came to its final chapter, not with dramatics or spectacle, but with the soft, steady certainty of justice fulfilled, a reminder that even those who hide in the deepest shadows cannot remain unseen forever, and that truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding its way through the trees.